He thought the heavy oak doors of our penthouse absorbed all my secrets. He thought my silence after his violent outbursts meant absolute submission. He genuinely believed no one would ever take the word of a quiet housewife over a charismatic venture capitalist. But when the judge finally pressed play on the courtroom projector, the sound of his heavy hand striking my face echoed through the dead silent room. He had no idea he had spent the last 3 years living inside a digital cage I built specifically for his destruction. The digital clock on the marble kitchen island glowed with the time 11:42 at night. I was standing perfectly still in the center of our $3.5 million Chicago penthouse A property that, despite his overwhelming arrogance, was legally registered entirely under my private limited liability company. The sharp burning sting on the left side of my face was already beginning to throb and swell. Julian had just landed a brutal backhand across my cheek with enough force to split my lower lip against my teeth. The warm, metallic taste of blood immediately flooded my mouth, pooling under my tongue. I did not raise my hand to cradle the wound. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response for people who do not have a tactical plan. I had a flawlessly executed strategy. Julian stood exactly 3 feet away from me, breathing heavily through his nose. His custom-tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a silk shirt slightly wrinkled from the sudden physical exertion of his rage. "Where is the $50,000 wire transfer, Victoria?" he demanded, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, barely contained fury. "It was supposed to clear into the offshore holding account by noon today. You had one simple job. You are supposed to handle my basic administrative tasks, and you cannot even move funds correctly." The Cayman Islands account was waiting for that deposit to cover the margin call. I looked directly into his eyes. My vision was perfectly clear, and my heart rate remained at a steady resting pace of 60 beats per minute. I knew exactly where that $50,000 was because I had intentionally rerouted the transfer to a flagged holding account to trigger an automatic federal audit protocol. It was a deliberate bottleneck designed to expose his fraudulent ledger. But I kept my facial expression entirely blank, revealing none of my calculations. I calmly reached across the imported granite counter, picked up a white silk dinner napkin, and gently pressed it to my bleeding lip. "I will call the bank at 8 in the morning," I said, my voice completely flat and steady. He scoffed a harsh sound of pure disgust that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. He raised his left wrist to adjust his platinum Rolex, a watch I had purchased for him 2 anniversaries ago, using my own discreet funds, just to maintain the public illusion of his massive financial success. "You are lucky I let you live here, Victoria," he sneered, looking around the massive open-concept living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. "You are incredibly lucky I tolerate your constant incompetence. Without me, you are just a glorified secretary fetching coffee and filing basic paperwork. If you ever mess up my money again, I will throw you out on the street with absolutely nothing." He turned on his heel, grabbing his leather car keys from the entryway console table. "I am going out," he announced unnecessarily. "Do not wait up for me. Fix the wire transfer by the time I wake up tomorrow, or we are going to have a much worse conversation." The heavy solid wood front door slammed shut behind him, rattling the expensive modern artwork hanging in the foyer. I stood alone in the quiet apartment. I knew exactly where he was going. He was driving his silver Porsche straight to the Gold Coast apartment he rented for his 24-year-old mistress. It was a luxury unit that cost him $8,500 a month, an apartment he paid for using the very corporate funds he just accused me of mismanaging. He had funneled over $104,000 to her this year, alone classifying the payments as independent contractor consulting fees. I walked over to the stainless steel kitchen sink and rinsed the blood from the silk napkin, watching the pale red water swirl down the drain. Julian thought I was a fragile, dependent wife who spent her days organizing his social calendar and arranging his dry cleaning deliveries. He genuinely believed the pathetic narrative we had constructed for the public just to stroke his fragile ego. He did not know that my glorified secretary title was a carefully maintained operational cover. I am the lead forensic auditor for the Apex banking conglomerate, the exact financial institution that underwrites his entire venture capital firm. I have unrestricted administrative access to every single corporate ledger, every hidden offshore transaction, and every fraudulent shell account he has opened over the last 5 years. I monitor his $250 million portfolio daily. I know that his reported 20% year-over-year growth is a complete fabrication built on a Ponzi scheme structure. I know exactly how much client money he has embezzled to fund his lavish lifestyle down to the last 73 cents. He thought he had just disciplined a helpless woman tonight. He thought his physical violence was a reliable tool to enforce my absolute obedience. He did not realize he had just physically assaulted the only person holding the keys to his complete financial and legal destruction. I dried my hands on a fresh linen towel. Tomorrow morning, I would not be calling the bank to fix his $50,000 transfer. I would be calling my brother-in-law to install the hidden surveillance network that would inevitably send my husband to federal prison. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, and the real game officially began. The heavy bronze doors of the private elevator chimed and slid shut, locking Julian out of the penthouse. The moment the digital floor indicator began its descent toward the lobby, the suffocating tension in the room instantly evaporated. I did not collapse onto the imported Italian leather sofa in a fit of tears. I did not run to the master bathroom to ice my swelling lip. I walked straight to my home office, locked the reinforced solid oak door behind me, and opened a hidden wall safe concealed behind a bookshelf. I pulled out my encrypted secondary phone, a device Julian did not even know existed. I dialed a highly secure number that was not saved in my contacts list. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, remarkably calm voice answered the call. It was Marcus. Marcus is not just my brother-in-law. He is a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and successful corporate litigation firms in downtown Chicago, a brilliant African-American attorney who married my younger sister 5 years ago. Since that day, we had maintained a quiet mutual respect based on our shared understanding of leverage and the absolute necessity of crushing your enemies with overwhelming legal force. "Are you secure, Victoria?" he asked, his voice completely devoid of sleep, despite the late hour of the night. "I am secure," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of emotion. Julian just escalated the situation exactly as we predicted. He struck me across the face hard enough to draw blood. He is currently in his car on his way to his mistress in the Gold Coast. He believes he has won an argument regarding a $50,000 wire transfer that I intentionally flagged and halted in the banking system today. "How much time do we have until he returns to the property?" Marcus asked, his mind already shifting into trial mode. "He will not be back before 7 in the morning at the earliest," I stated with absolute certainty. "He likes to sleep in late after he exerts himself physically." "I will be there at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning," Marcus said. "I am bringing the technical architecture team with me. Leave the secondary service elevator unlocked." The line went dead. Marcus did not mean a team of building architects. He meant digital forensic architects. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy reinforced service doors in the back of the massive kitchen slid open. Marcus stepped inside, wearing a flawless charcoal suit that made him look like he was heading straight to federal court rather than orchestrating a midnight domestic surveillance operation. Behind him walked 3 technicians dressed entirely in unmarked black clothing, carrying heavy reinforced equipment cases. Marcus walked directly up to me and inspected my face under the bright glare of the kitchen pendant lights. He looked critically at the split lip and the dark purple bruising that was already spreading rapidly across my left cheekbone. His jaw tightened visibly, but his expression remained fiercely analytical. "He crossed a permanent line tonight," Victoria Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Now we erase his entire existence." I nodded slowly and gestured outward to the massive open-concept living space. The technicians did not waste a single second of our limited window. They immediately opened their cases, revealing rows of highly specialized elite surveillance equipment. We bypassed standard commercial nanny cameras that Julian could accidentally discover. We integrated military-grade 4K audio-visual microlenses directly into the underlying structural framework of the entire penthouse. A technician began systematically swapping out the plastic casing on the overhead smoke detectors in the main hallway and the primary living room. Hidden perfectly inside were wide-angle panoramic lenses capable of capturing ultra-high-definition video in near-total darkness. Another technician carefully removed the custom wooden acoustic panels covering the heating and cooling vents directly above the marble kitchen island. The technician embedded a highly sensitive directional microphone and a microscopic pinhole camera directly into the ductwork, ensuring that every future word and physical movement in this room would be recorded with terrifying, crystal-clear accuracy. "We are completely bypassing the local wireless internet network," Marcus explained softly. "These recording devices are hardwired directly into the smart home mainframe located in your hidden server closet down the hall. The data will not be stored on any physical hard drives inside this apartment. The exact moment these cameras capture any motion or audio, the files are instantly encrypted using military-grade protocols and uploaded via a dedicated fiber optic line directly to a secure private cloud server managed exclusively by my law firm. Even if Julian somehow manages to find a camera and physically smashes it to pieces, the footage of him committing that destructive act will already be locked safely in a digital vault he cannot ever touch or delete." I watched the third technician seamlessly blend a final micro camera into the heavy metallic base of a modern bronze sculpture sitting prominently on the foyer console table. As the physical perimeter was established, Marcus and I sat down at the heavy oak dining table to thoroughly review the aggressive legal bedrock of our operation. The state of Illinois operates under a remarkably strict two-party consent law regarding the recording of private conversations. Secretly recording a spouse inside a shared marital home without their knowledge would normally be inadmissible as evidence and could result in severe criminal charges. Julian would absolutely try to use the two-party consent statute to throw out the evidence. But Julian was incredibly arrogant and entirely ignorant of his actual legal standing in this relationship. "You reviewed the original trust documents?" Marcus asked, sliding a thick stack of legal papers across the smooth wood toward me. "I read them every single month," I replied confidently, tracing my index finger over the deeply embossed corporate seal of my private limited liability company. Marcus smiled a cold, predatory smile. "Julian truly believes he is the undisputed master of this domain," Marcus said. "He is completely unaware that 3 years ago, you legally placed the total ownership of this $3.5 million property into an impenetrable blind trust controlled by your corporate financial entity. Legally speaking, Julian is nothing more than a temporary tenant residing in a commercial property owned by a third-party holding corporation." "Exactly," I confirmed, leaning back in my chair. "And as the sole managing director and chief executive of that holding corporation, I have the absolute legal right to install comprehensive security monitoring systems to protect my expensive corporate assets and monitor tenant behavior." "We are operating under the expectation of privacy legal loophole," Marcus said. "Because your corporation legally owns the property in its entirety and the smart home infrastructure is registered as a commercial security system, the recordings completely circumvent the standard domestic two-party consent laws. A tenant cannot claim a reasonable expectation of privacy in the common living areas of a unilaterally monitored corporate property. By the time the early morning sun began to slowly rise over the cold waters of Lake Michigan, the technical team had completely vanished. The penthouse looked exactly as it had when Julian violently slammed the door hours earlier." Marcus checked his watch. It was exactly 6 in the morning. "He will be back very soon," Marcus said, walking slowly toward the service elevator. "Remember, Victoria, this trap only works flawlessly if he fully believes he is still in complete, absolute control over you. Every single arrogant word he speaks from now on is another permanent nail driven directly into his federal prison coffin. I will give him all the rope he needs to hang himself," I replied, my voice completely steady. Marcus stepped backward into the waiting elevator. "Call my direct line the exact second you have the primary footage," he said just before the heavy metal doors slid closed. I walked slowly back into the sprawling kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of ice-cold water. My split lip was throbbing painfully, but my analytical mind was sharper than it had ever been. I looked up directly at the ventilation grate above the marble island. I knew the tiny invisible lens was already watching me, recording my every breath. The digital perimeter was fully active and armed. My husband foolishly thought he was returning to a frightened, helpless, submissive wife. He was actually walking blindly into a fully operational federal evidence-gathering trap, and I was more than ready to play my part flawlessly until the bitter end. The next 3 weeks transformed our sprawling luxury penthouse into a high-stakes psychological war zone. I moved through my daily routines with the precise, calculated discipline of a soldier operating deep behind enemy lines. Every morning, I poured his black coffee. Every afternoon, I arranged his dry cleaning, and every evening, I waited for the heavy metallic click of the front door unlocking. Julian had no idea that he was walking onto a meticulously designed soundstage, where every single breath he took was being logged, analyzed, and permanently archived by my legal team. The tension in the apartment was a suffocating physical weight, but I welcomed it. I needed him to feel comfortable enough in his unchecked power to let his darkest impulses take total control. I needed him to escalate. The first major escalation occurred on the evening of the 7th day. I had prepared a prime rib roast for dinner, a meal he had specifically requested that morning, before leaving for his venture capital firm. The dining room table was set with our finest imported porcelain and heavy silver cutlery. The lighting was dimmed to a soft amber glow, completely concealing the microscopic camera lens embedded perfectly into the base of the crystal chandelier hanging directly above us. A second camera watched from the digital thermostat on the far wall, while a third maintained a wide-angle view from the smoke detector near the hallway. Julian arrived home at 8:30 in the evening, radiating a toxic, aggressive energy. He threw his leather briefcase onto the entryway bench and marched directly to the dining room. He poured himself a massive glass of expensive bourbon from the heavy Waterford crystal decanter sitting on the side buffet. He did not greet me. He sat down, picked up his silver carving knife, and sliced into the meat. He chewed once, swallowed, and violently slammed the heavy silver knife down onto the porcelain plate. The sharp clattering sound echoed sharply through the quiet room. "This is completely overcooked, Victoria," he growled, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "It is like chewing on dry leather. You have absolutely nothing to do all day, except sit in my expensive house and spend my hard-earned money, and you cannot even manage to follow a basic recipe." The meat was perfectly medium rare, exactly as he always demanded. But I knew this had absolutely nothing to do with the dinner. This was about power and his need to project his workplace frustrations onto a target he believed was entirely defenseless. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands gently on my lap. "I'm sorry, Julian," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I will have the private chef prepare something else for you immediately." My calm, compliant response seemed to enrage him even further. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He stood up so quickly that his heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. He grabbed the heavy crystal decanter filled with bourbon. He locked his furious eyes onto mine and hurled the solid glass vessel directly at my head with all of his physical strength. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to protect my face. I tilted my head exactly 2 inches to the left. The heavy crystal decanter flew past my ear so closely, I felt the rush of displaced air against my cheek. It smashed violently against the custom wallpaper behind me, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards of sharp glass and splashing dark amber liquid across the expensive artwork. I do not bust my ass bribing federal compliance officers to ignore my unregistered securities just to come home to a ruined meal, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do you have any idea how much money I had to wire to that offshore shell company today, just to keep the Securities and Exchange Commission off my back? If my firm goes under because of an audit, you are going back to the miserable poverty you came from." I sat in absolute silence, staring at the shattered glass on the floor. I did not shed a tear. I simply analyzed the data. The hidden camera in the thermostat captured the violent throwing motion in high definition. The chandelier camera captured his enraged face and my total lack of physical provocation. And the wide-angle lens captured the exact trajectory of the heavy glass projectile, proving it was aimed directly at my skull. Most importantly, the highly sensitive microphones captured his explicit verbal admission of bribing federal compliance officers and hiding assets in offshore shell companies. It was a flawless piece of evidence. The second major conflict erupted just 4 days later, and it provided the exact financial receipts I needed to finalize the trap. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the apartment was bathed in bright natural sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian was pacing furiously back and forth across the kitchen, holding his mobile phone tightly against his ear. He was arguing with his mistress, a 24-year-old aspiring model who was becoming increasingly demanding about her monthly allowance. When he finally ended the call, he slammed his phone down onto the cold, imported Italian marble island. He looked across the kitchen counter at me. I was quietly organizing a stack of household utility bills, pretending to be completely oblivious to his personal drama. Victoria. He snapped his tone sharp and commanding. I need you to log into the secondary laptop and alter the digital timestamps on the Peterson account ledgers. You need to make it look like the quarterly distributions were delayed by a banking error, not an internal firm transfer. I looked up from my paperwork, projecting an aura of innocent confusion. I want to make sure I do this exactly right, Julian, I said, my voice steady and deliberately inquisitive. Are you asking me to alter the official client ledgers for the Peterson Family Trust? Why do we need to change the timestamps on their quarterly distributions? Because I said so, he barked, taking a heavy step toward me. Because I currently have $2.4 million of their client investment funds sitting in a private LLC account under my name, and I need another 3 weeks to quietly move the capital back before they notice the missing liquidity. That idiot girl in the Gold Coast apartment just demanded a new Range Rover and a completely renovated wardrobe to keep her mouth shut about our arrangement. I am not using my own personal liquidity to fund her expensive habits when client money is just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. I maintained my carefully constructed mask of hesitation. But Julian altering client ledgers to cover a $2.4 million deficit is highly illegal, I whispered, taking a small calculated step backward. If the banking auditors at Apex Holdings discover that missing capital, they will freeze every single account tied to your venture capital firm. My intentional mention of the banking auditors pushed him entirely over the edge. He closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. He reached out with both of his large hands and grabbed me violently by the shoulders. He lifted me slightly off the floor and shoved me backward with tremendous, terrifying force. My lower back crashed brutally against the sharp, unforgiving edge of the marble kitchen island. A sharp, blinding spike of physical pain shot directly up my spine, taking the breath completely out of my lungs. He leaned in close, pressing his body weight against mine, trapping me against the cold stone. You do not ever question my financial decisions, you stupid, ungrateful bitch. He hissed, his face mere inches from mine. I own you. I own this firm. I can move $2.4 million out of the Peterson Trust anytime I want, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop me. Now, you will walk into that office, open that laptop, and forge those digital timestamps exactly as I instructed, or I will break your jaw. I looked deeply into his angry, dilated pupils. I felt the deep, dark bruising already beginning to form across my lower back, but my mind was entirely focused on the ceiling directly above his head. Hidden perfectly inside the wooden acoustic panels covering the ventilation ductwork, a microscopic pinhole camera and a highly sensitive directional microphone were silently recording the entire encounter. The microphone captured the sickening physical thud of my body hitting the solid marble. It captured his violent, heavy breathing, and it captured crystal clear, pristine audio of him explicitly confessing to the $2.4 million embezzlement, the forgery of client ledgers, and the direct funneling of stolen corporate funds to his mistress. The evidence was absolutely devastating and completely undeniable. The final escalation occurred at the end of the third week, effectively sealing his inevitable legal and personal destruction. By this point, my quiet maneuvers at the apex banking conglomerate were beginning to secretly constrict his firm's cash flow. I had initiated a series of automated blind audits that restricted his ability to move massive amounts of unregulated capital. Julian did not know I was the architect of his financial misery, but the mounting pressure was driving his paranoia to dangerous, unprecedented levels. It was past midnight. The penthouse was shrouded in deep shadows. I was walking down the long main hallway toward the master bedroom when he suddenly stepped out of the darkness of his private study, blocking my path. He smelled heavily of stale scotch and nervous sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and erratic. The digital perimeter was fully armed, and the microscopic lens embedded in the hallway smoke detector had a perfect, unobstructed view of his face. He reached out and grabbed my throat. He did not squeeze hard enough to strangle me, but his grip was firm, suffocating, and highly intimidating. He pushed me backward until my shoulder blades hit the cool, painted drywall. "Things are getting incredibly complicated at the firm, Victoria," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "Someone at the bank is looking very closely at my private holding accounts. If everything falls apart and the federal authorities come knocking, I need to know that you are going to keep your mouth completely shut. I need to know that you will take the absolute blame for the altered ledgers on the secondary laptop." I stared back at him, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to show even a single microscopic fraction of fear. And if I refused to take the blame, "Julian," I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely detached, "what happens to me if I decide to pack my bags and walk out that front door tomorrow morning?" His grip tightened painfully around my neck. He leaned his forehead against mine. "If you ever think about walking out that door, Victoria, I will erase you," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan whisper. "I have enough money hidden in offshore accounts that the federal government does not even know exist. I can hire people who specialize in making problems permanently disappear. If you try to leave me or betray me to the authorities, they will never find your body, and no one will ever look for a pathetic, useless housewife. Do you understand me?" "I understand you perfectly, Julian," I replied. He released my throat and stumbled back into his study, leaving me alone in the dark hallway. I walked calmly into the master bathroom, locked the heavy door, and turned on the cold water faucet. I pulled out my encrypted secondary phone and dialed my brother-in-law. Marcus answered on the first ring. "We have it all," I told him, staring at my own cold reflection in the illuminated vanity mirror. Every single violent act was completely captured. Marcus confirmed, his deep voice echoing with the absolute certainty of a victorious predator. The decanter throw, the physical assault against the marble island, the physical intimidation in the hallway. "And the financial admissions?" I asked, carefully wiping a smudge of makeup from my cheek. "Flawlessly documented," Marcus replied. The digital vault now contains his explicit confession to bribing federal compliance officers, embezzling $2.4 million from the Peterson Trust, forging official client ledgers, and threatening premeditated murder to protect his hidden offshore assets. Every single act of domestic battery is now permanently legally fused to a massive federal financial felony. The two-party consent law cannot protect him now. The trap is fully set. I ended the call and slipped the encrypted phone back into its hidden compartment. Julian had spent the last 3 weeks attempting to systematically break my spirit through physical violence and psychological terror. He thought he was asserting his dominance over a weak, isolated woman. He did not realize he had just handed a veteran forensic auditor and a ruthless corporate litigator the exact weapons required to completely annihilate his entire existence. The evidence-gathering phase was officially over. It was time to drag my husband out of the shadows and slaughter him in the bright, unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was bathed in the warm golden light of a dozen massive crystal chandeliers. 500 of the wealthiest and most influential figures in Chicago society were gathered for the annual charity gala. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the low hum of calculated networking. Women in designer gowns and men in custom-tailored tuxedos mingled over glasses of vintage champagne. I stood quietly near our reserved table, wearing a floor-length emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly over my frame. The high neckline of the dress was a deliberate choice, designed specifically to conceal the faint yellow and purple bruising that still lingered around my collarbone from his physical assault 2 weeks prior. Julian was in his absolute element tonight. He moved gracefully through the crowded ballroom, shaking hands with banking executives and laughing loudly with powerful local politicians. He projected the flawless image of a highly successful venture capitalist who had the entire world sitting comfortably in the palm of his hand. Tonight was technically the eve of our 5th wedding anniversary. The event organizers had specifically requested that Julian say a few words to commemorate the occasion and highlight our philanthropic partnership. He had told me earlier that morning to wear my best jewelry and prepare to smile for the society photographers. I knew he was planning something, but I did not anticipate the sheer breathtaking audacity of his preemptive strike. At exactly 9:30 in the evening, the gentle clinking of silverware faded away as the master of ceremonies invited Julian to the main stage. The heavy velvet curtains framed him perfectly as he adjusted the microphone stand. The audience quieted down completely, giving him their undivided attention. He offered them a warm, charismatic smile that slowly dissolved into an expression of profound, carefully rehearsed sorrow. Thank you all for being here tonight to support such a vital cause. Julian began, his voice echoing richly through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are here to talk about helping those who cannot help themselves. We are here to talk about compassion. And tonight, I need to ask for your compassion, not just for the foundation, but for my own family. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. I did not move a single muscle. Many of you know that tomorrow marks my 5th wedding anniversary. Julian continued lowering his head slightly so the stage lights caught the tragic angle of his jaw. I had originally planned to stand up here and celebrate the beautiful life my wife Victoria and I have built together, but the painful reality behind closed doors is often very different from the perfect image we present to the world. A collective murmur of confusion and anticipation rippled through the grand ballroom. The elite crowd leaned in collectively, hungry for the sudden, unexpected scandal. It breaks my heart to share this publicly. Julian said, his voice cracking with a perfectly calculated amount of manufactured emotion. But I believe in transparency. For the past 2 years, Victoria has been fighting a losing battle with severe mental instability and chronic addiction. The entire room inhaled sharply. 500 pairs of eyes began to frantically search the crowd, looking for my reaction. I have tried everything humanly possible to save her. Julian continued, his tone dripping with the exhausted, noble suffering of a martyr. I have hired the best private psychiatrists. I have arranged for discreet residential treatment programs. I have spent countless sleepless nights holding her, trying to protect her from her own destructive impulses. But her erratic behavior has only escalated into dangerous, violent outbursts. I've had to physically restrain her just to keep her from hurting herself and destroying our home. As a husband, you vow to stand by your partner through sickness and health. But there comes a point where you realize that you cannot save someone who refuses to be saved. For my own physical safety and for the integrity of my firm, I have made the agonizing decision to formally separate from Victoria, effective immediately. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The elite socialites and powerful billionaires stared at me with a toxic mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and deep, condescending pity. In their eyes, I had instantly transformed from a respected society wife into a tragic, broken liability. Julian had masterfully painted himself as the tireless, saintly caretaker who had finally been pushed past his breaking point by an ungrateful, unstable addict. It was a brilliant, preemptive legal and social strategy. By publicly labeling me as violent and mentally unstable, he was laying the groundwork to completely discredit any future allegations I might make against him. If I ever came forward with claims of domestic abuse, he could simply point to this night and say he had warned everyone about my delusions. But Julian had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He expected me to react like the emotionally fragile victim he was describing to the crowd. He expected me to burst into hysterical tears. He expected me to scream at him or throw my drink or run out of the ballroom in a state of deep public humiliation. Any of those dramatic reactions would have instantly validated his completely fabricated narrative. I did absolutely none of those things. I remained standing perfectly still in my emerald green silk dress. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. The ice cubes clinked softly against the expensive crystal glass. I lowered the glass and looked directly up at the stage. I locked eyes with my husband across the massive, crowded room. My face was a mask of absolute, unreadable calm. I did not glare at him. I did not show an ounce of anger or betrayal. I simply stared at him with the cold, calculating precision of an apex predator watching its prey blindly walk straight into a lethal trap. I knew that the microscopic cameras hidden in our penthouse had already captured his physical violence and his explicit financial confessions. I knew that my brother-in-law Marcus was already finalizing the devastating federal litigation that would rip his entire life apart. Julian was standing on a brightly lit stage, proudly digging his own grave with a silver shovel, and I was more than happy to stand by and watch him work. From the main stage, Julian looked down at me. For a fraction of a second, his perfectly rehearsed, tragic expression faltered. He saw my absolute stillness. He felt the heavy, unnerving weight of my silent, unwavering gaze. His subconscious instinct warned him that something was terribly wrong. A woman who had just been publicly destroyed by her husband in front of the most powerful people in the city should not be standing there looking so incredibly peaceful. She should not be looking at him like she held the keys to his complete and total annihilation. For a brief fleeting moment, I saw a flash of genuine uncertainty behind his eyes. He gripped the sides of the wooden podium tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. The suffocating silence of my reaction was actively rejecting the script he had written for me. But Julian was a man entirely consumed by his own monumental hubris. His massive ego quickly overrode his basic survival instincts. He convinced himself that my silence was simply the paralyzing shock of a defeated woman who finally realized she had been beaten. He took a deep theatrical breath and turned his attention back to his wealthy, captive audience. I ask for your privacy and your prayers during this incredibly difficult transition. Julian concluded, his voice returning to its smooth, confident cadence. Thank you all for your understanding and your continued support of our charitable foundation. The crowd erupted into a round of warm, sympathetic applause. Several prominent board members actually stood up to offer him a standing ovation for his remarkable bravery and vulnerability. Women dabbed at their eyes with silk handkerchiefs, completely captivated by his tragic performance. Men nodded in somber respect, silently congratulating him for cutting ties with a sinking ship. I watched the entire spectacle unfold with a profound sense of clinical detachment. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel broken. I felt a deep, resounding sense of victory. Every single person clapping for him in this room was a high-profile witness to his public perjury. He had just gone on the record in front of 500 elite investors, claiming I was violently unstable and completely responsible for the collapse of our marriage. When the federal authorities eventually played the hidden camera footage in open court, proving he was the actual violent abuser and a massive financial fraud, this exact speech would destroy the last remaining shreds of his social and professional credibility. As the applause finally began to die down, the orchestra resumed playing a soft, melancholic string arrangement. The guests immediately began whispering urgently among themselves, stealing quick sideways glances in my direction. I placed my half-empty glass of sparkling water carefully onto a passing waiter's silver tray. I smoothed down the front of my silk dress and turned toward the grand exit doors. I walked out of the ballroom with my head held high, my posture perfect, and my dignity entirely intact. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured steps of a woman who was already miles ahead of the man who thought he had just left her behind. The preemptive strike at the charity gala was officially over. The public stage had been set. Now it was time to return home and let him spring the legal ambush he foolishly believed would be my final undoing. The ride back to our building was suffocatingly quiet, but it was a silence I welcomed completely. The heavy-tinted windows of the black town car reflected the blurred neon lights of the Chicago skyline as we sped through the midnight streets. Julian sat in the opposite corner of the spacious leather back seat, bathed in the pale blue glow of his mobile phone screen. He was typing furiously, his thumbs flying across the digital keyboard, with the frantic energy of a man who believed he had just successfully executed the most brilliant public relations maneuver of his entire career. He did not look at me once during the 20-minute drive. He did not offer a single word of apology or explanation for the devastating performance he had just delivered at the charity gala. In his mind, the war was already won. He had successfully painted me as a violent, unpredictable addict in front of the most powerful financial and political figures in the city. He thought my quiet compliance in leaving the ballroom was a white flag of complete surrender. He had no idea that my silence was actually the sound of a carefully constructed steel trap snapping shut around his ankles. The town car pulled up to the circular driveway of our luxury residential building. The uniformed doorman hurried forward to pull the heavy passenger doors open. The sharp midnight air coming off Lake Michigan hit my face, carrying the bitter chill of early winter, but I did not shiver. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked with perfect posture toward the brightly lit glass entrance. Julian followed closely behind me, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the pristine pavement. As the sliding glass doors parted and we stepped into the expansive imported marble lobby, I immediately noticed that we were not alone. Sitting on one of the velvet lounge chairs, positioned near the private elevator bank, was a man I recognized immediately. It was Richard Montgomery. He was a senior partner at a boutique family law firm known exclusively for representing wealthy, aggressive men in highly contentious, high-net-worth divorces. Richard was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that looked entirely too formal for a midnight meeting. A thick, genuine leather briefcase rested on his lap. When he saw us approaching, he stood up immediately and offered Julian a grim, conspiratorial nod. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer. The late-night concierge at the front desk wisely averted his eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in his computer monitor. Julian stepped around me and stood shoulder to shoulder with his attorney, forming a united front of calculated legal intimidation. Richard reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound tightly by a dark blue folder. He did not greet me. He did not offer any professional pleasantries. He simply placed the heavy folder onto a small glass table, positioned between us. "This is where your incredibly generous free ride officially ends," Victoria Julian said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous, empty lobby. The tone he used was completely different from the tragic, heartbroken cadence he had weaponized at the gala just an hour ago. Now, he sounded entirely like the ruthless, predatory venture capitalist he truly was. "I told you that my patience had a strict limit, and you have finally crossed it. You embarrassed me for the last time." Richard Montgomery stepped forward and tapped the thick blue folder with his expensive fountain pen. "Inside this folder is an emergency eviction notice and a comprehensive marital settlement agreement," Richard stated in a dry, mechanical voice. "My client is offering you a highly streamlined exit from this marriage. By signing these documents tonight, you will completely relinquish all future claims to the marital estate. You will waive any right to spousal support or alimony. You will surrender all equity in the venture capital firm, the investment portfolios, and the offshore holding accounts. Furthermore, you will agree to leave the penthouse tonight with nothing more than the clothes currently on your back and whatever personal items you can fit into a single standard overnight bag." I looked down at the thick stack of papers and then back up at Julian. I maintained an expression of mild, polite curiosity. And what exactly happens if I decide that I do not want to sign away my entire life at midnight in the lobby of my own apartment building? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotional inflection. Julian smiled a cold, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket and slowly pulled out a single sheet of pale yellow paper. It was an official medical document bearing the highly recognizable letterhead of a prominent private psychiatric facility located just outside the city limits. He held the document up so I could clearly see the aggressive, bold signature at the bottom of the page. If you refuse to sign the settlement agreement right now, I will make one phone call to the authorities, Julian whispered, his voice dripping with pure malicious intent. This is a legally binding psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Harrison Sterling. It officially diagnoses you as an immediate violent threat to yourself and to others. It is an authorization for a mandatory, involuntary, 72-hour psychiatric hold. If you do not sign those divorce papers, Richard and I will have the police escort you directly from this lobby into a locked, padded room. By the time you manage to convince a judge to let you out next week, I will have legally moved every single liquid asset we own into untouchable offshore accounts. Oh, you will be completely penniless, totally discredited, and heavily medicated. You have exactly 2 minutes to make your choice. I stared at the forged medical document. My analytical mind processed the data with blinding speed. Julian had just handed me the ultimate piece of criminal leverage. To secure that signature, he would have had to bribe a licensed medical professional with a massive sum of untraceable cash. Bribing a physician to falsify mental health records in order to extort a spouse during a divorce proceeding is a severe federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum prison sentence. He was openly committing extortion and medical fraud right in front of me, completely confident that his wealth and social standing made him entirely bulletproof. He thought he was backing me into a terrifying, inescapable corner. He did not realize he was enthusiastically throwing himself directly into the lethal legal wood chipper I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously building. I looked at Richard Montgomery, the supposedly brilliant, high-priced divorce attorney. Richard clearly believed he was representing a financial titan who held all the cards. Richard had absolutely no idea that the venture capital firm he was trying to protect was currently sitting on $2.4 million of embezzled client funds. Richard did not know that the luxury penthouse he was trying to evict me from was actually owned by a blind trust registered entirely to my private limited liability company. Most importantly, Richard did not know that my brother-in-law Marcus was already working with federal banking regulators to permanently freeze every single one of Julian's financial accounts at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. By demanding I sign this heavily skewed settlement agreement, Julian was actually doing me the greatest legal favor imaginable. By legally severing my financial ties to his venture capital firm tonight, I was officially insulating myself from the massive federal fallout that would completely destroy his company tomorrow. He thought he was stripping me of my wealth. In reality, he was aggressively taking sole, undivided ownership of a sinking ship loaded with toxic, fraudulent debt. He was demanding full legal responsibility for a company that was about to be raided by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I did not argue. I did not plead for mercy. I reached into my small silk evening clutch and retrieved my personal Mont Blanc fountain pen. The polished black resin and silver trim gleamed sharply under the bright lobby lights. I uncapped the pen and leaned over the glass table. I flipped to the final page of the thick blue folder. I did not bother to read the meticulous, restrictive clauses Richard had spent hours drafting. I simply placed the nib of my pen against the heavy paper and signed my name with smooth, elegant, deliberate strokes. I signed the property waiver. I signed the spousal support waiver. I signed the non-disclosure agreement. I executed every single signature line with absolute, flawless precision. When I finally stood up and clicked the cap back onto my Mont Blanc pen, the look of pure, unadulterated shock on Richard Montgomery's face was genuinely priceless. The high-priced lawyer had clearly prepared himself for a hysterical screaming match. He had expected tears begging and desperate negotiations. My total silent compliance completely short-circuited his legal strategy. Julian, however, simply smirked. His massive unchecked ego immediately interpreted my calm cooperation as total, absolute submission. He genuinely believed his threat of the psychiatric ward had completely broken my spirit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, silver money clip. He peeled a crisp $500 bill from the thick stack of cash and casually tossed it onto the glass table right next to the freshly signed divorce papers. "Call yourself a cab, Victoria," he said, his voice laced with heavy, condescending pity. "Go find a cheap motel room somewhere on the south side of the city. Do not ever try to contact me again. If you show up at my office or try to call my phone, I will have that psychiatric hold activated instantly. You are completely, entirely done." I looked down at the $500 bill resting on the glass table. I did not reach for it. I simply looked back up at the man I'd shared a bed with for the last 5 years. I memorized the smug, arrogant look on his face, knowing with absolute certainty that it was the very last time I would ever see him smile. "Have a good night, Julian," I said, my voice soft, calm, and perfectly polite. I turned around and walked away. I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The cold wind whipped fiercely against my silk dress, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me perfectly warm. I walked past the line of waiting taxicabs and headed straight toward the dark, tinted Mercedes, idling quietly near the corner of the street. As I approached the luxury vehicle, the rear passenger door swung open smoothly. I slid into the plush leather back seat and pulled the door completely shut, locking out the noise of the city. Marcus was sitting next to me wearing a dark tailored suit and holding an illuminated digital tablet. His intense, highly analytical eyes scanned my face in the dim light of the cabin, assessing my physical and emotional state. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his deep voice resonating with quiet, protective authority. "I am completely fine," I replied, resting my hands gently on my lap. He presented the settlement agreement and the eviction notice exactly as we anticipated. He also presented a forged psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Harrison Sterling. He explicitly threatened to have me involuntarily committed to a locked mental health facility if I refused to sign away my rights to the marital estate. Marcus let out a low, dark chuckle that sounded incredibly dangerous. He just added criminal extortion and federal medical fraud to his rapidly growing list of felony charges. Marcus noted his fingers flying quickly across the screen of his digital tablet. And the documents. I signed everything I confirmed, leaning my head back against the soft leather headrest. I legally surrendered all claims to his venture capital firm and his investment portfolios. My personal assets are now completely legally detached from his corporate infrastructure. When the federal banking authorities freeze his accounts and seize his firm tomorrow morning, I will be entirely insulated from the financial blast radius. He now legally owns 100% of a massive fraudulent enterprise. "Perfect," Marcus said, tapping a final command into his tablet and locking the screen. "The trap is now officially fully armed, and the legal perimeter is entirely secured. The federal regulators have already reviewed the hidden camera footage and the financial audit logs you provided. They are preparing the arrest warrants as we speak." Marcus tapped the dark tinted glass dividing the front and rear cabins. The driver immediately put the powerful vehicle into gear and pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the late-night city traffic. I looked out the window, watching the towering luxury building fade slowly into the distance. Julian was currently standing in that bright marble lobby, celebrating his brilliant, flawless victory. He was holding a stack of signed papers he believed guaranteed his absolute freedom and unlimited wealth. He had no idea he was actually holding his own signed confession and his one-way ticket to federal prison. The waiting game was officially over. The legal war had been triggered, and I was going to utterly destroy him. At precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting perfectly still inside a highly secure, soundproof glass conference room at my brother-in-law's downtown law firm. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the sprawling Chicago skyline, but my undivided attention was locked entirely on the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. Marcus sat directly across the heavy mahogany table from me, wearing a flawless dark navy suit and sipping a cup of black coffee. Between us rested a digital tablet displaying a live high-definition video feed transmitted directly from the hidden cameras securely embedded inside the luxury penthouse I had vacated just 8 hours prior. The digital timestamp on the video feed read 8:01 in the morning. Julian walked into the expansive marble kitchen wearing a plush white hotel-style bathrobe. He looked remarkably rested and dangerously arrogant. He poured himself a shot of dark espresso from the expensive Italian machine, whistling a cheerful, unrecognizable tune. He genuinely believed he had executed a masterclass in psychological warfare the previous night. He thought I was currently shivering in some cheap roadside motel, completely broken and entirely stripped of my financial dignity. He set his porcelain espresso cup down on the imported kitchen island and flipped open his custom silver laptop. I watched his face closely through the microscopic lens hidden perfectly inside the overhead ventilation duct. I knew exactly what he was doing. It was a Friday morning, and Julian always processed his personal wealth transfers at the end of the week. He was logging into the secure portal for the Apex banking conglomerate, fully intending to sweep the remaining liquid capital from our primary joint marital accounts into his heavily shielded offshore holding entities. He planned to drain the accounts entirely, leaving me with absolutely nothing to claim during the impending divorce litigation. I typed a secure access command into my own laptop, bypassing the standard consumer interface and entering the master administrative ledger for the Apex banking conglomerate. As a senior director of compliance, I had total authorized oversight of these specific accounts. I watched his digital footprint hit the bank servers in real time. He navigated to the primary joint checking account, an account that just yesterday held a verified balance of $4,750,000. On the live video feed, I saw the exact second the banking portal loaded on his screen. The cheerful whistling stopped instantly. His right hand froze entirely over the trackpad. The porcelain espresso cup slipped from his left hand, crashing onto the hard marble floor and shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. Dark brown liquid splashed violently across his bare feet, but he did not even flinch. He leaned so close to his laptop screen that his nose nearly touched the glass. The balance displayed on his screen was exactly $0.00. He frantically clicked the refresh icon, his breathing becoming heavy and erratic. The screen reloaded. $0. He navigated to our secondary high-yield investment portfolio, which had contained $2.8 million in diversified liquid assets. $0. He checked the emergency reserve savings account. $0. Every single financial account that bore both of our names had been completely and entirely liquidated. Julian grabbed his mobile phone from the counter with shaking hands and dialed his private wealth manager at Apex. The hidden directional microphone above the kitchen island captured his end of the conversation with terrifying, crystal-clear precision. He began screaming into the receiver, demanding to know where his $7.5 million had gone. He threatened to have the wealth manager fired, blacklisted, and thrown into federal prison for gross financial incompetence. I sat in the quiet conference room and listened to him self-destruct. The wealth manager, acting exactly on the strict federal compliance protocols I had quietly instituted weeks ago, calmly informed Julian that the accounts had been entirely depleted by the primary co-signer at exactly 2 a.m. The manager then delivered the secondary fatal blow. He informed Julian that all remaining corporate accounts tied to his venture capital firm, including his personal social security number and his corporate tax identification number, were now officially frozen. They were locked under a mandatory federal auditing hold due to flagged suspicious offshore wire transfers. Julian threw his mobile phone violently across the kitchen. It smashed into the stainless steel refrigerator, denting the expensive metal and cracking the digital display screen. He gripped the edges of the marble island, his knuckles turning completely white as he gasped for air. He finally realized that the quiet, submissive wife he had humiliated at the charity gala and ambushed in the lobby had completely outmaneuvered him. I had not run away in defeat. I had strategically retreated to a safe distance before detonating a massive financial bomb directly under his entire life. His panic quickly morphed into a desperate, vicious rage. He walked over to the shattered phone, picked it up from the floor, and realized the screen was broken, but the device was still operational. He immediately dialed Richard Montgomery, his high-priced aggressive divorce attorney. He did not bother to explain the federal banking freeze. He simply screamed into the broken phone that I had stolen $7.5 million of his hard-earned money and that he needed an emergency court order to force the bank to reverse the transfers immediately. Through the audio feed, we heard Richard Montgomery trying to calm his frantic, wealthy client. Richard explained the harsh reality of joint banking laws. Because my name was fully authorized on those specific accounts, I had the absolute legal right to withdraw the funds. Richard told him that no judge would grant an emergency weekend reversal simply because a spouse emptied a joint account during a separation. In order to get an immediate ex parte emergency hearing from a county judge, they needed to prove that I was a violent, unhinged threat who was actively liquidating assets to flee the state or fund an illegal addiction. They needed a compelling, terrifying narrative. They needed immediate physical proof of my supposed severe mental instability. I need you to file a domestic violence restraining order against her. Right now. Julian commanded, his voice dropping to a sinister, calculated whisper. I need you to tell the judge that she completely lost her mind last night. Tell them she attacked me in the penthouse, destroyed the property, drained the bank accounts in a manic episode, and fled into the night. Tell them she is a violent danger to herself and to the public, and I need immediate emergency conservatorship over all marital assets to protect the estate. Richard Montgomery paused clearly, hesitating at the aggressive, illegal strategy. The lawyer warned Julian that filing a sworn affidavit for a restraining order required actual physical evidence of abuse. A judge would not grant an emergency asset freeze based solely on a verbal accusation without some form of documented physical injury or police report. Julian looked up, staring directly at his own reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. I will give you your physical evidence, he told his lawyer, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. Just draft the emergency petition and have it ready for my signature in exactly 1 hour. Marcus let out a low, dark chuckle from across the mahogany table. He tapped the digital tablet, pulling up the secondary camera feed located in the master bathroom. He is actually going to do it. Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the live footage. His arrogance has completely blinded his basic survival instincts. He is about to voluntarily manufacture physical evidence to defraud a state judge. We watched in absolute silence as Julian marched down the long hallway and entered the brightly lit master bathroom. The hidden wide-angle camera embedded in the ceiling smoke detector captured the entire pristine room. Julian walked directly up to the massive vanity mirror. He unknotted his plush white bathrobe and let it slide off his shoulders, exposing his bare chest and arms. He opened my vanity drawer and began tearing through my personal belongings until his hand closed around a heavy, solid silver hairbrush. He stood perfectly still for a moment, taking a deep breath to brace himself for the physical pain. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he swung the heavy silver hairbrush directly into his own left bicep. The loud, sickening smack of solid metal striking human flesh echoed clearly through the hidden microphone. A dark, angry red mark instantly appeared on his skin. He did not stop. He raised the brush again and struck himself brutally across the upper chest, leaving a harsh, jagged scratch near his collarbone. He hit himself a third time, driving the edge of the brush hard into his own ribs. He dropped the heavy silver brush onto the marble countertop, panting heavily from the self-inflicted exertion. He picked up his cracked mobile phone and activated the camera. He twisted his torso into the bright vanity lighting, capturing several high-resolution photographs of the rapidly swelling bruises and angry red scratches covering his chest and arm. He immediately opened his email application, attached the fabricated photographic evidence, and sent the digital files directly to Richard Montgomery. He looked at his reflection in the mirror and smiled a dark, triumphant smile. He genuinely believed he had just masterfully secured his financial salvation. He thought he had outsmarted the legal system by creating an undeniable physical record of my supposed violent insanity. He had absolutely no idea that he had just committed one of the most severe federal crimes possible, completely on high-definition video. By noon that exact same day, a formal electronic notification pinged on Marcus's secure laptop. It was the official digital service from the county courthouse. Marcus opened the heavy legal file and began reading the petition out loud, his deep voice filling the quiet conference room. Julian had formally filed an emergency ex parte petition for a domestic violence restraining order and a temporary financial conservatorship. Attached to the petition was a sworn legal affidavit signed under penalty of perjury by Julian himself. In the deeply fabricated document, he claimed that I had violently attacked him with a heavy blunt object during a severe psychotic break. He claimed I had caused significant bodily harm before illegally hacking into his secure banking portal and draining $4.7 million to fund a dangerous underground addiction. He attached the 3 high-resolution photographs of his self-inflicted bruises, officially submitting them into the permanent public court record as verified physical evidence of my assault. He demanded an emergency hearing first thing Monday morning to legally freeze my personal assets, revoke my access to all corporate properties, and place his venture capital firm under absolute judicial protection from my supposed reckless interference. Marcus closed the digital file and leaned back in his leather executive chair, resting his hands calmly on the mahogany table. He just signed a sworn affidavit lying to a state judge. Marcus stated methodically, listing the compounding felony charges. He submitted fabricated photographic evidence to a court of law. He used electronic mail to transmit fraudulent legal documents crossing state lines and triggering federal wire fraud statutes. And he did all of this in a desperate attempt to illegally reclaim funds that were already seized under a federal banking investigation. I looked back at the live video feed. Julian was sitting on the living room sofa, drinking a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, completely relaxed and utterly confident in his inevitable victory. He believed he had successfully launched a devastating smear campaign that would permanently destroy my reputation and legally force me into absolute poverty. He thought the emergency hearing on Monday morning would be a quick, effortless formality where a sympathetic judge would hand him the keys to his entire financial empire. He was blindly sprinting headfirst into a federal perjury trap of such massive, catastrophic proportions that he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The smear campaign he launched to destroy my life had just become the exact unshakable foundation of his own permanent legal annihilation. I closed my encrypted laptop, feeling a profound sense of absolute icy peace. The weekend was going to be incredibly long for him, but Monday morning was going to be an absolute slaughter. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open precisely at 9 a.m. on Monday. I walked down the long, polished marble corridor with my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. Marcus walked beside me, radiating a calm but absolute authority. The courtroom was already packed with legal clerks, junior associates, and a few curious spectators who had caught wind of the high-profile emergency hearing. Julian was already seated at the petitioner's table. He was wearing a dark charcoal Tom Ford suit, tailored to absolute perfection. His hair was meticulously styled to look just slightly disheveled, projecting the image of a man who had spent the entire weekend suffering from profound emotional distress. When he saw me enter the room, he visibly recoiled, shifting his chair closer to his attorney, Richard Montgomery. He was playing the role of the terrified, abused spouse with sickening dedication. The Honorable Judge Harrison, a strict conservative man with 30 years on the bench, entered the room and the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. The emergency hearing for the domestic violence restraining order and absolute financial conservatorship was officially in session. Richard Montgomery stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He approached the podium with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he held an unbeatable hand. He began his opening statement by immediately assassinating my character. He painted a tragic, vivid picture for the judge, describing Julian as a brilliant, hardworking venture capitalist who had dedicated his entire life to building a successful financial empire from nothing. He told the court that Julian had married me out of the pure goodness of his heart, hoping to rescue me from a life of mediocrity. Richard described me as a manipulative, gold-digging parasite who had contributed absolutely nothing of value to the marriage or to the corporate success of the venture capital firm. He claimed I spent my days lounging in a luxury penthouse, draining my husband's hard-earned wealth to fund a secret, dangerous lifestyle. He told the judge that my complete lack of ambition eventually twisted into a dark, violent jealousy. As Julian became more successful, my supposed mental instability escalated into physical rage. Richard claimed I could not handle the pressure of being married to a titan of industry, so I resorted to violent physical outbursts to establish dominance and control. Richard paced back and forth across the courtroom floor, his voice echoing with calculated outrage. He explained that just 3 days ago, my supposed madness reached a terrifying climax. He told the judge that I suffered a severe psychotic break inside the penthouse. According to Richard, I physically assaulted my husband in a blind rage and then maliciously hacked into his secure banking portal. He claimed I illegally drained $4.7 million from their joint marital accounts to fund my escape and finance my underground addictions. He described me as an immediate violent threat to the public and a catastrophic danger to the survival of the venture capital firm. Richard concluded his opening statement by demanding that the court grant Julian immediate emergency conservatorship over all marital assets to prevent me from completely destroying the corporate infrastructure. He demanded that my personal bank accounts be permanently frozen and that a strict restraining order be placed upon me to protect his client from further physical harm. The judge listened to every single word with deep, intense focus. When Richard finished speaking, the judge turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with absolute, undisguised disdain. He saw a cold, calculating woman sitting silently at the defense table, showing zero remorse for the supposed devastation she had caused. He did not know that my silence was actually the disciplined restraint of a forensic auditor observing a masterclass in federal perjury. I sat perfectly still, with my hands folded neatly on my lap. I did not shake my head in denial. I did not whisper angrily to my attorney. I simply maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with the judge, allowing him to project his own biased assumptions onto my quiet demeanor. My complete lack of emotional reaction only reinforced the false narrative Richard had just spun. In the eyes of the court, I looked exactly like the remorseless sociopath they were accusing me of being. The bailiff called Julian to the witness stand. He stood up slowly, taking a deep, shaky breath, as if gathering the last remaining fragments of his shattered courage. He walked to the wooden witness box with a slight, deliberate limp, suggesting hidden physical injuries. He placed his left hand on the Bible and raised his right hand, swearing, under penalty of perjury, to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He sat down and adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling just enough to be noticeable to the judge. Richard Montgomery approached his client with a gentle, sympathetic tone. He asked Julian to describe the events of the past 3 weeks. Julian looked down at his hands, his voice completely soft and broken. He delivered a performance that belonged on a silver screen. He described how he would come home exhausted from managing massive client portfolios only to be met with my screaming accusations and violent temper tantrums. He claimed I was deeply paranoid and constantly hallucinated that he was hiding money from me. Julian looked up at the judge, and a single, perfectly timed tear rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away with his thumb, apologizing for his display of emotion. He told the court that he had tried so hard to be patient with me. He claimed he had begged me to seek professional psychiatric help, but I violently refused every single time. He described how my verbal abuse slowly escalated into physical violence over the last month. He told the judge that I started throwing heavy objects at him when I did not get my way. He claimed that during one particularly terrifying episode, he was forced to physically restrain me against the kitchen counter just to prevent me from grabbing a deadly weapon. He completely inverted reality, taking the exact moments he had brutally assaulted me and twisting them into desperate acts of self-defense. He described the night of the charity gala, claiming he was forced to announce our separation publicly because he genuinely feared for his life and needed the protection of a large crowd to safely escape my wrath. Richard Montgomery then retrieved a manila folder from his desk and approached the witness stand. He handed Julian the high-resolution photographs of the severe bruising and deep scratches on his chest and arms. Julian looked at the photos and visibly shuddered, turning his face away in manufactured horror. Richard formally submitted the photographs into the permanent court record as physical evidence. He asked Julian to explain exactly how he sustained those violent injuries. Julian looked directly at the judge, his voice trembling with artificial trauma. He claimed that after the charity gala, we returned to the penthouse and I completely lost my mind. He testified under oath that I grabbed a heavy, solid silver hairbrush and began viciously beating him across the chest and arms while he desperately tried to shield his face. He claimed he refused to hit me back because he could never bring himself to strike a woman, even in self-defense. He told the court that after I finished beating him, I ran to the secondary laptop, hacked his banking credentials, drained the joint accounts, and fled into the night, leaving him bleeding and completely terrified. The judge examined the glossy photographs of Julian's self-inflicted wounds. His jaw tightened in anger. He looked over the heavy wooden bench, glaring at me with profound disgust. The courtroom was completely silent, totally captivated by the tragic tale of the battered, wealthy husband and his monstrous wife. Julian had successfully painted a flawless masterpiece of deceit. He had securely locked every single lie into the official federal court record under direct oath. He had committed extreme criminal perjury before a sitting federal judge. He had submitted actively fabricated physical evidence to defraud the legal system. He thought he had completely won. He leaned back slightly in the wooden witness chair, a microscopic fraction of a smug, triumphant smile touching the corners of his mouth. He was absolutely certain that my attorney would now attempt to cross-examine him by aggressively attacking his emotions or desperately denying the abuse, which would only make me look even more defensive and guilty. But my attorney was Marcus. Marcus did not operate on emotion. Marcus operated on absolute surgical destruction. The judge turned to our table and asked if the defense had any questions for the witness. Marcus stood up slowly, buttoning his dark suit jacket with calm, deliberate precision. The sheer physical presence of the man commanded instant, undeniable respect. He did not carry any folders or legal pads. He walked toward the center of the courtroom completely empty-handed. His expression was a mask of cold, analytical stone. He stopped exactly 6 feet away from the witness stand and looked directly into Julian's eyes. The contrast between the two men was staggering. Julian was projecting the soft, trembling vulnerability of a victim. Marcus was projecting the terrifying, unyielding gravity of an executioner. Marcus did not begin by questioning Julian's feelings. He did not ask Julian how much the bruises hurt. He did not waste a single breath trying to defend my character or justify my actions. He completely ignored the dramatic, emotional narrative Richard Montgomery had spent the last hour meticulously building. Marcus knew that arguing against an emotional performance only validates the premise of the performance. Instead, Marcus focused entirely on the rigid, inflexible architecture of time and space. He focused on the raw, undeniable data. He looked at Julian, and his deep, resonant voice filled the quiet courtroom without the need for a microphone. "Mr. Julian," he began, his tone perfectly flat and polite, "you have just provided this court with a very detailed and highly disturbing account of repeated physical abuse and severe financial theft. I simply want to ensure that the official court record is absolutely perfectly accurate regarding the specific timeline of these terrible events." Julian sat up slightly straighter in his chair. He was momentarily confused by the calm, non-confrontational approach. But his massive ego quickly reassured him that he was fully in control. He nodded eagerly, eager to solidify his flawless victory. "Of course," Julian replied, his voice dripping with earnest sincerity. "I want the record to be completely accurate as well." Marcus took a single step closer. "Excellent," Marcus said. "Let us begin with the first major incident you described. You testified that your wife threw a heavy glass object at your head in a violent rage. Can you tell this court the exact date and approximate time this specific, unprovoked attack occurred?" Julian did not even hesitate. He had rehearsed his lies perfectly. "It was exactly 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday evening," Julian stated confidently. "I remember because I had just returned from a board meeting. It was approximately 8:30 at night." Marcus nodded slowly, his face remaining totally blank. Tuesday evening at 8:30, he repeated, making sure the court reporter transcribed the exact words. "And the second major incident you described, where you were forced to physically restrain your wife against the marble kitchen counter to prevent her from grabbing a weapon. When exactly did that terrifying event take place?" Julian leaned forward, his confidence growing by the second. He believed Marcus was inadvertently helping him build his case by emphasizing the timeline of the abuse. That was 4 days later on a Saturday afternoon. Julian testified, his voice ringing clear and steady. "It was right around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was standing in the kitchen taking a very important business call regarding the Peterson family trust accounts. I was trying to manage my client's $2.4 million investment portfolio when she suddenly became completely unhinged and attacked me. I had to restrain her against the marble island just to protect my own life." Marcus nodded again, his eyes locking onto Julian with the cold precision of a sniper aligning a target. "Saturday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, Marcus repeated smoothly. He paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the specific mention of the Peterson family trust to hang heavily in the silent air. And finally, Marcus said, his voice dropping half an octave lower. "You testified that the most severe physical attack, the incident where your wife allegedly beat you with a solid silver hairbrush, causing the physical bruising documented in the court evidence, occurred after the charity gala. Can you provide the court with the precise time of this final brutal assault?" Julian looked directly at the judge to ensure his tragic victimhood was fully registered. It was late Friday night, moving into early Saturday morning. Julian said, his voice cracking perfectly on cue. "We arrived back at the penthouse just after midnight. The violent attack began at approximately 12:15 in the morning and lasted for nearly 20 minutes before she fled to steal the banking funds." Marcus stood perfectly still, letting the absolute silence of the courtroom amplify the immense weight of the specific times Julian had just provided under oath. Marcus looked back at me, sitting completely motionless at the defense table. I gave him a single, nearly imperceptible blink of confirmation. The trap was now fully, irrevocably set. Julian had just enthusiastically provided the exact dates and the exact specific timestamps for every single violent encounter that had taken place inside our luxury penthouse. He had locked his massive, fabricated lies into the permanent federal court record while sitting under direct, sworn oath. He had no idea that those exact dates and those precise timestamps directly matched the encrypted high-definition video and audio files currently sitting on a secure flash drive inside Marcus's suit pocket. Julian had just handed us the exact mathematical coordinates required to completely obliterate his entire existence. Marcus walked slowly back to the defense table, his polished leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the heavy courtroom carpet. He did not look at Julian, and he did not look at the opposing counsel. His posture was perfectly straight, projecting the terrifying calm of a man who held the absolute power of life and death in his hands. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored dark navy suit jacket and withdrew a small, sleek black encrypted flash drive. He held the digital device up between his thumb and forefinger, letting the harsh fluorescent lighting of the federal courtroom catch the cold metallic edge of the casing. The entire room seemed to suddenly hold its collective breath. Up until this exact fraction of a second, Julian had been riding the exhilarating, intoxicating high of his own fabricated performance. He had completely convinced himself that this emergency hearing was simply a battle of verbal testimonies, where his practiced charisma and manufactured tears would easily overpower my absolute silence. But the sudden introduction of physical digital media into the legal equation instantly shattered his fragile illusion of control. I watched his posture stiffen violently. The manufactured tragic vulnerability completely vanished from his handsome face and was instantly replaced by a sudden sharp spike of genuine primal panic. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his deep voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "The defense would like to officially submit this encrypted digital drive into evidence as Defense Exhibit A. This drive contains pristine, continuous, high-definition audio and visual recordings captured directly from the interior of the primary residence in question. Furthermore, these specific recordings correspond exactly to the precise dates and the specific timestamps the petitioner just eagerly provided to this court under direct sworn oath." Richard Montgomery practically leaped out of his expensive leather chair, knocking his heavy mahogany legal pad onto the polished wooden floor with a loud, echoing clatter. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly as the devastating reality of the situation crashed down upon his entire legal strategy. "I aggressively and unconditionally object to the admission of this alleged digital evidence. The state of Illinois operates under a remarkably strict two-party consent law regarding the recording of private domestic conversations. My client was never informed that he was being constantly recorded inside his own private home. He never gave his explicit legal consent to be filmed, monitored, or archived by his spouse. Any audio or visual recordings captured secretly inside a shared marital residence directly violate the fundamental legal expectation of privacy and are entirely inadmissible in any federal court of law. This is a blatant illegal invasion of privacy and a desperate violation of the Federal Wiretap Act." Richard was breathing heavily, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He turned to Julian and shot his wealthy client a furious, panicked glare. Julian had explicitly assured his high-priced attorney that there were absolutely no security cameras inside the luxury penthouse. Julian had sworn up and down that his physical abuse and his arrogant financial confessions were completely undocumented and entirely untraceable. Richard realized in a terrifying split second that his arrogant client had confidently led them both directly into a massive, catastrophic legal ambush. Julian gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand, his knuckles turning completely white as his heart rate skyrocketed. Judge Harrison leaned forward over the heavy wooden bench, peering severely over the rims of his reading glasses. He looked down at Marcus, his expression stern and deeply skeptical. "Counselor," the judge began, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "Mr. Montgomery is absolutely correct regarding the strict nature of the two-party consent statute in this specific jurisdiction. Secretly recording a spouse inside a domestic marital dwelling without their explicit documented knowledge is a severe violation of state privacy laws. Unless you can provide this court with a massive, impenetrable legal justification for exactly how these recordings were obtained, I will not only sustain the objection, but I will strongly consider holding both you and your client in contempt of court for attempting to introduce illegally gathered surveillance evidence." Marcus did not flinch. He did not break eye contact with the angry judge for even a fraction of a second. He slowly placed the small black flash drive onto the edge of the judge's elevated bench. Then he turned smoothly and walked back to our defense table. I reached down into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound tightly together by a solid brass clasp. The top page featured the deeply embossed official corporate seal of my private financial holding company. I handed the heavy stack of documents to Marcus without changing my expression or saying a single word. Marcus walked the heavy documents directly up to the bench and placed them squarely in front of Judge Harrison. "Your Honor." Marcus set his tone perfectly level and completely devoid of any arrogance. The defense fully recognizes and deeply respects the strict two-party consent laws of this great state. However, those specific privacy statutes apply exclusively to private domestic residences and shared marital property. They rely entirely on the legal premise that the individuals being recorded have a reasonable legal expectation of privacy within their own privately owned home. Marcus paused for a few seconds, allowing his heavy words to echo through the completely silent courtroom. The recordings contained on that encrypted flash drive were not captured inside a marital home. Marcus continued, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable truth. They were captured inside a commercial corporate asset. If you examine the authenticated property deeds, the municipal tax records, and the official corporate charter I have just provided, you will see that the $3.5 million luxury penthouse located in downtown Chicago is not and has never been a marital asset. My client Victoria did not purchase that massive property as a wife. The property is legally owned in its absolute entirety by an impenetrable blind trust managed exclusively by Apex Financial Holding Limited Liability Company. Judge Harrison frowned deeply, picking up the heavy stack of documents. He flipped past the first page, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon, the notarized signatures, and the official state property registration stamps. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the crisp, heavy paper rustling between the judge's fingers. My client is the sole managing director and the absolute chief executive of that holding corporation, Marcus explained, guiding the judge through the complex financial architecture. Mr. Julian never contributed a single dollar to the original down payment. He has never paid a fraction of the annual property taxes. His name has never appeared on the property deed, the commercial mortgage, or the corporate insurance policies. Legally speaking, Mr. Julian is nothing more than a temporary month-to-month tenant residing inside a commercial property owned completely by a third-party corporate entity. Julian gasped audibly from the witness stand. He stared at me with wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. For 3 entire years, he had strutted around that massive luxury penthouse, treating it as his own personal, undisputed kingdom. He had constantly threatened to kick me out of my own home, believing his immense venture capital wealth gave him absolute dominion over our living situation. He had completely ignored the stack of dense legal papers I had quietly asked him to sign shortly after we were married, papers that he assumed were standard tax deferments, but were actually binding commercial tenant waivers. He finally realized in front of the entire federal court that his massive, unchecked ego had completely blinded him to the cold, hard legal reality of his own pathetic existence. Richard Montgomery began frantically flipping through his own copies of the marital asset disclosures, desperately searching for any loophole, any missing signature, or any technical error that could invalidate the corporate shield. But there was absolutely nothing to find. I was a senior forensic auditor who managed billions of dollars in international wealth. My financial architecture was utterly flawless and completely legally bulletproof. But, Your Honor, Richard stammered, his aggressive confidence entirely shattered and his voice shaking with desperation. Even if the property is technically owned by a commercial corporate entity, it was still utilized daily as a primary domestic dwelling. My client still maintained a fundamental, reasonable expectation of privacy when the heavy front doors were closed and locked for the night. Marcus turned slowly to face Richard, his dark eyes completely void of any human sympathy. An individual cannot claim a reasonable expectation of privacy in the common monitored areas of a unilaterally controlled corporate holding. Marcus countered, his voice slicing through the courtroom like a surgical steel blade. Your Honor, the holding corporation that owns the property is legally mandated by its massive commercial insurance underwriters to maintain comprehensive security monitoring to protect its multi-million-dollar real estate asset. The cameras in question were not cheap domestic nanny cams hidden maliciously by a jealous, vindictive spouse. They are military-grade 4K audio-visual micro-lenses integrated directly into the foundational smart home mainframe of the corporate property. Marcus turned his attention back to the judge, pointing respectfully at the thick stack of documents resting on the elevated bench. As you will clearly see in Section 4 of the submitted corporate charter, the smart home security logs are legally retained by the holding company for explicit security purposes and strict liability protection. Because the corporation legally owns the property in its absolute entirety, and the infrastructure is registered with the city as a commercial security system, the interior recordings completely and entirely circumvent the standard domestic two-party consent laws. A temporary tenant occupying a corporate space simply does not possess the legal standing to demand privacy in the heavily monitored common areas of that specific corporate asset. Furthermore, the tenant in question actively engaged in the violent destruction of corporate property during his unprovoked physical outbursts, which immediately triggered the emergency archiving protocols of the automated security system. Judge Harrison slowly lowered the documents. He took off his reading glasses and placed them gently onto his wooden desk. The stern, skeptical expression on his face had completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound legal fascination and a growing, terrifying realization of exactly what was happening in his courtroom. He looked closely at the perfectly authenticated corporate deeds. He looked at the notarized commercial tenant waivers bearing Julian's own careless, arrogant signature. Then the judge looked directly at Julian, who was currently sweating profusely through his expensive designer suit, his chest heaving with silent panic. The judge realized in that exact moment that Julian had just spent the last hour committing aggressive federal perjury under direct oath. He realized that Julian had fabricated a completely fictional narrative of severe domestic abuse to steal millions of dollars from a woman who had actually spent years meticulously building a flawless, inescapable legal cage around him. The judge despised arrogant individuals who attempted to weaponize his courtroom using fabricated evidence, and Julian had just been caught absolutely red-handed lying to a federal magistrate. Judge Harrison picked up his heavy, solid wooden gavel. "Mr. Montgomery," the judge said, his voice cold, sharp, and entirely unforgiving. "Your client does not own the property in question. He has absolutely no equity in the estate. He is legally classified as a commercial tenant residing in a corporate space. The holding corporation possesses the absolute explicit legal right to secure and monitor its own financial assets to protect against physical damage and liability. The expectation of privacy simply does not apply in this specific architectural and corporate structure. Your desperate objection regarding the two-party consent statute is completely without merit and is denied in its entirety." The judge struck the sounding block with a loud, cracking thud that echoed like a gunshot through the completely paralyzed courtroom. "The objection is firmly overruled," the judge declared. "Defense Exhibit A is officially admitted into the permanent federal court record without any restrictions." Richard Montgomery slowly sank back into his leather chair, looking like a man who had just been violently struck by a speeding freight train. He pushed his legal pad away from him and rested his pale face in his trembling hands. He knew the case was entirely over. He knew his wealthy, arrogant client was about to be completely legally slaughtered, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the impending execution. Marcus offered the judge a brief, highly respectful nod. He turned smoothly to the armed bailiff standing silently near the empty jury box. "Please bring in the audio-visual equipment," Marcus instructed calmly. "We are going to review the security footage for the court right now." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and two court technicians wheeled a large high-definition digital projector and a massive white viewing screen directly down the center aisle. The quiet squeaking of the rubber wheels against the polished floor was the only sound in the completely breathless room. Julian watched the large white screen approaching like a condemned man, watching the executioner slowly sharpen the guillotine blade. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and completely out of control. He looked over at me, sitting completely motionless at the defense table. He finally saw the absolute terrifying truth hidden behind my silent, compliant exterior. I had not been trapped in a miserable, abusive marriage with him. He had been trapped in a highly controlled, experimental environment with an apex predator. The Trojan horse had successfully breached the fortress walls, and the absolute destruction of his entire life was about to begin. The federal courtroom was submerged in a heavy, suffocating silence as the two court technicians finished positioning the massive white viewing screen directly in front of the elevated wooden bench. The harsh fluorescent lights above us flickered off, leaving the cavernous room bathed in the cold, pale glow of the high-definition digital projector. Marcus stood at the defense table, operating his encrypted laptop with the calm surgical precision of a technician disarming a highly volatile explosive. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at Richard Montgomery. And he certainly did not look at Julian, who was currently sitting completely paralyzed in the wooden witness box. Julian was staring at the blank white screen with the wide, unblinking eyes of a man who suddenly realized he had willingly strapped himself into the electric chair. Marcus tapped the enter key on his keyboard. The digital projector hummed to life, and the massive screen illuminated the darkened courtroom. This was not a single grainy security video. It was a meticulously edited chronological timeline of absolute, undeniable horror. The video began with a stark black screen displaying a crisp white timestamp in the bottom right corner. It was 11:42 at night. On the exact Tuesday, Julian had just sworn under oath that I had first attacked him. The black screen dissolved into crystal clear, 4K resolution military-grade video footage. The angle was wide and perfectly focused, capturing the entire expanse of the luxury kitchen. The courtroom watched as the digital version of Julian stood exactly 3 feet away from me. He was not cowering in fear. He was not a battered husband begging for mercy. He was an aggressive, towering predator. The highly sensitive, hidden microphones had captured the audio with terrifying studio-quality perfection. Every single breath, every single rustle of fabric, and every single word echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art courtroom speakers. "Where is the $50,000 wire transfer, Victoria?" The digital Julian demanded, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. The audio boomed through the quiet courtroom, completely destroying the soft-spoken, tragic persona he had just spent an hour building on the witness stand. The entire gallery leaned forward in collective shock. The video showed me standing perfectly still, my face completely blank, just as I was sitting right now at the defense table. Then, without a single microscopic fraction of physical provocation, the digital Julian raised his hand and landed a brutal, vicious backhand directly across my face. The sharp, sickening crack of his heavy hand striking my cheekbone echoed like a gunshot through the federal courtroom. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands freezing entirely over her stenography machine. The video continued to play, showing my lower lip split open and the dark blood pooling in my mouth. It showed Julian scoffing in absolute disgust. "You are lucky I let you live here," he sneered from the massive screen, adjusting his expensive watch. "Without me, you are just a glorified secretary." I looked over at the witness box. Julian had physically shrunk into his chair. All the blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The charismatic, arrogant venture capitalist was completely gone, replaced entirely by a terrified, hollow shell. He had just testified under direct penalty of perjury that he would never strike a woman, even in self-defense. The high-definition video had just proved him to be a violent, remorseless abuser. But Marcus was not finished. The physical abuse was merely the opening act. The real destruction was the financial confession. The screen faded to black, and a second timestamp appeared. It was 8:30 in the evening, just 4 days later. The video feed shifted to the dining room camera hidden perfectly inside the crystal chandelier. The footage showed Julian sitting at the heavy wooden dining table, eating a prime rib dinner. The courtroom watched as he suddenly became violently enraged over the meal. They watched him stand up so quickly that his heavy wooden chair crashed onto the hardwood floor. They watched him grab the heavy crystal bourbon decanter. The judge leaned dangerously far over his elevated bench, his eyes locked onto the screen. He watched Julian hurl the solid glass decanter directly at my head with maximum physical force. He watched the heavy crystals smash into 1,000 glittering pieces against the custom wallpaper mere inches from my skull. It was a clear, undeniable act of severe aggravated assault. But then the audio feed picked up Julian's screaming voice, and the entire legal foundation of his venture capital firm instantly vaporized. I do not bust my ass bribing federal compliance officers to ignore my unregistered securities just to come home to a ruined meal. The digital Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. Do you have any idea how much money I had to wire to that offshore shell company today just to keep the Securities and Exchange Commission off my back? The impact of those specific words hitting the silent courtroom was absolutely catastrophic. Judge Harrison sat back in his heavy leather chair, his eyes widening in profound disbelief. Julian had just casually confessed to massive federal financial crimes directly on tape. He had admitted to bribing federal regulators. He had admitted to operating illegal, unregistered securities. He had admitted to funneling money into offshore shell companies to actively evade the Securities and Exchange Commission. These were not minor accounting errors. These were severe Class A federal felonies, carrying mandatory minimum sentences of decades in federal prison. Richard Montgomery, the aggressive high-priced divorce attorney, was completely paralyzed. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes darted frantically between the massive viewing screen and his wealthy client. Richard suddenly realized that he had just spent the entire morning legally fighting to secure sole ownership of a company that was actually a massive criminal enterprise. He had drafted emergency court orders, demanding that Julian retain total control of accounts that were actively being investigated for federal wire fraud. The screen faded to black for a third time. A new timestamp appeared reading 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday. This was the exact date and time Julian had explicitly testified that he was forced to physically restrain me to protect his own life. The video proved otherwise. The wide-angle lens captured Julian pacing furiously in the bright, natural sunlight of the kitchen. It captured him, hanging up his mobile phone and turning his unprovoked rage directly toward me. The audio boomed through the courtroom speakers, carrying his sharp, commanding tone. I need you to log into the secondary laptop and alter the digital timestamps on the Peterson account ledgers, he ordered. The courtroom listened in dead silence as the digital version of myself calmly asked him why we needed to change the timestamps. Because I currently have $2.4 million of their client investment funds sitting in a private limited liability company account under my name, Julian confessed, his voice echoing off the high federal ceilings. The courtroom gallery erupted into a collective shocked whisper. The bailiff had to step forward and raise his hand to restore absolute silence. Julian had just openly admitted to embezzling $2.4 million from a specific named family trust account. He had instructed his wife to actively forge digital financial records to cover up the massive theft. He had provided the exact dollar amount and the exact location of the stolen liquidity. The video then showed the physical assault. It showed Julian closing the distance between us, grabbing me violently by the shoulders and shoving me brutally backward against the sharp edge of the marble kitchen island. It captured the sickening thud of my spine hitting the cold stone. It captured him, leaning over me, threatening to break my jaw if I did not help him forge the documents to fund his 24-year-old mistress. Richard Montgomery had seen enough. The attorney physically stood up and violently pushed his heavy leather chair away from the petitioner's table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. Richard took 3 large steps backward, physically and legally distancing himself from the man sitting in the witness box. Richard was a ruthless divorce lawyer, but he was not a fool. He knew that Julian was entirely radioactive. By submitting the sworn affidavit and the fabricated photographs this morning, Richard had unknowingly aided and abetted a massive perjury scheme. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship. He stood near the wooden swinging doors of the courtroom gallery, looking at Julian with absolute pure revulsion. The final clip began to play. The timestamp read 12:15 in the morning, the exact time Julian claimed I had beaten him with a solid silver hairbrush before stealing his money. The video showed the dark hallway of the penthouse. It showed Julian stepping out of his private study, blocking my path. It showed him reaching out and grabbing my throat, pushing me backward against the drywall. "If you ever think about walking out that door, Victoria, I will erase you. The digital." Julian whispered, his voice a terrifying deadpan hiss. "I have enough money hidden in offshore accounts that the federal government does not even know exist. I can hire people who specialize in making problems permanently disappear." The threat of premeditated murder hung heavily in the cold courtroom air. But the final nail in the coffin, the absolute ultimate piece of Trojan horse evidence, was the audio recording from the foyer the night he tried to force me to sign the divorce papers. The screen went completely black, but the audio recording from the hidden microphone near the front door played with pristine clarity. It was Julian's voice dripping with malicious intent as he presented the fake medical document. "This is a legally binding psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Harrison Sterling." The audio played loud and clear. "It officially diagnoses you as an immediate violent threat to yourself and to others. If you do not sign those divorce papers, Richard and I will have the police escort you directly from this lobby into a locked, padded room." The audio continued, capturing Julian's fatal admission. "I paid Dr. Sterling $50,000 in untraceable cash to sign this evaluation without ever meeting you." The digital Julian bragged his massive ego, completely sealing his own fate. Nobody is going to believe a crazy woman over a respected medical professional and a wealthy venture capitalist. The audio recording clicked off. The massive white viewing screen went completely black. The digital projector hummed quietly in the background before Marcus calmly tapped the keyboard, shutting the machine down completely. The harsh fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom slowly flickered back on, illuminating the absolute devastation left in the wake of the screening. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating physical weight. It was the absolute terrifying silence of total destruction. Julian was sitting in the wooden witness box, looking like a man who had just watched his own autopsy. His face was entirely devoid of color, his skin a ghastly pale white. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. The brilliant, charismatic performance he had delivered just 30 minutes ago was completely annihilated. Every single lie he had carefully constructed, every single fabricated tear he had shed, and every single false accusation he had leveled against me had been systematically, brutally dismantled by his own recorded words and actions. He slowly turned his head and looked at his attorney. Richard Montgomery was still standing by the gallery doors, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, refusing to even acknowledge his client's existence. Richard had already mentally drafted his immediate motion to withdraw as counsel. Julian was completely alone. The elite social status, the massive venture capital wealth, the expensive suits, and the arrogant intimidation tactics were absolutely useless in the face of raw, undeniable high-definition truth. I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a single fraction of emotional satisfaction. I simply watched him drown in the inescapable reality of his own making. I had endured his physical violence, his psychological torture, and his profound arrogance for years. I had silently collected every single receipt, every single bruise, and every single financial discrepancy. I had built the digital cage, locked the steel door, and calmly handed the key directly to a federal judge. Judge Harrison was sitting entirely frozen on his elevated bench. His right hand was tightly gripping the heavy wooden gavel, holding it suspended midair, as if he had forgotten how to breathe. The judge stared at Julian with an expression of such profound, intense disgust that it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. The judge had spent his entire career presiding over complex legal battles, but he had never witnessed such a massive, arrogant, and utterly flawless display of criminal perjury, extortion, domestic violence, and federal financial fraud presented in one single, continuous timeline. The judge slowly lowered the gavel. He did not strike the sounding block. He placed the wooden hammer gently onto his desk, as if loud noises would shatter the fragile, absolute tension in the room. He looked past Julian, ignoring the pathetic, trembling man in the witness box entirely. The judge looked directly at Marcus, and then his eyes shifted to me. The disdain and biased assumption that had clouded the judge's face at the beginning of the hearing were completely gone. They were replaced by a deep, silent acknowledgement of the absolute, masterful execution of justice he had just witnessed. The false narrative was completely dead. The Trojan horse had delivered its payload with absolute lethal precision. Julian thought no one would ever believe me when the door closed and his anger took over. He was right. No one had to take my word for anything. They simply had to sit back in absolute silence and watch him completely and entirely destroy himself. The crushing silence in the federal courtroom was so absolute that the mechanical hum of the overhead ventilation system sounded like a roaring jet engine. Julian was completely broken, slumping heavily in the wooden witness box, like a discarded marionette whose strings had been violently and permanently severed by an unseen force. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic gasps as his mind desperately tried to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic disaster unfolding around him. But the strategic decimation of his life was only halfway complete. Before Julian could even attempt to recover his breath or formulate a desperate, pathetic apology to the court, Marcus reached down into his heavy leather briefcase for the final time. He did not pull out another sleek digital flash drive or a simple legal pad. He pulled out a massive physical binder. It was a remarkably dense 400-page bound document printed entirely on heavy premium legal paper, containing every single hidden ledger bank statement and encrypted email communication he mistakenly believed he had permanently deleted from his private corporate servers. The sheer physical weight of the binder made a loud, highly authoritative thud as Marcus dropped it squarely onto the polished mahogany defense table. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through the stagnant, terrified courtroom air like a freshly sharpened executioner's blade. The defense would like to officially submit this comprehensive forensic financial dossier into evidence as Defense Exhibit B. Richard Montgomery, the aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney who had spent the entire morning screaming about the expectation of privacy, did not even flinch. He did not stand up to object. He did not offer a single word of legal protest. The lawyer simply stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of his client's massive criminal exposure. Richard had mentally and professionally checked out of the proceedings, entirely abandoning Julian to the unforgiving federal wolves waiting at the door. Judge Harrison tore his disgusted gaze away from the trembling man in the witness box and looked down at the massive black binder Marcus had just confidently presented. "What exactly am I looking at, counselor?" the judge asked, his stern tone reflecting a complex mixture of exhaustion, deep frustration, and undeniable morbid curiosity. Marcus did not immediately answer the judge's question. Instead, he took a deliberate, highly calculated step backward and gestured respectfully toward me. "I believe my client is the most qualified individual in this entire room to explain the exact highly technical contents of that specific document. Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly, folding his hands together in perfect professional composure. For the first time since this chaotic emergency hearing officially began, I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal skirt and looked directly up at the elevated wooden bench. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes narrowing as he carefully evaluated me. Up until this exact fraction of a second, I had been nothing more than a quiet, silent observer, a supposedly helpless, deeply terrified housewife who had been maliciously dragged into his courtroom under completely false and highly defamatory pretenses. Now I was stepping out of the carefully constructed shadows and taking absolute total control of the narrative. Your Honor. I began, my voice ringing clear, steady, and perfectly calm across the silent, breathless room. For the past 5 incredibly long years, my husband has operated under the deeply arrogant and completely misguided belief that I was a simple, uneducated secretary who spent my days managing his dry cleaning deliveries and organizing his trivial social calendar. He testified under direct sworn oath this very morning that I was a manipulative, gold-digging parasite who contributed absolutely nothing of value to our marriage or to the ongoing corporate success of his venture capital firm. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting my eyes lock onto Julian with the cold, unyielding precision of an apex predator. Julian looked back at me, his chest heaving with silent, absolute terror. My actual legal name is Victoria Pierce, I stated, projecting my voice effortlessly so every single person sitting in the packed courtroom gallery could hear me perfectly. And my actual professional title is the Senior Director of Compliance and Lead Forensic Auditor for the Apex Banking Conglomerate. I am the Chief Financial Officer, directly and solely responsible for underwriting, monitoring, and authorizing the massive corporate credit lines that entirely fund my husband's fragile venture capital firm. The collective, audible gasp from the crowded gallery was immediate and highly visceral. Julian gripped the solid wooden railing of the witness box so tightly that his knuckles turned completely translucent under the harsh lighting. His jaw dropped open in absolute, unadulterated shock. He had spent years mocking my intelligence and constantly belittling my supposed secretarial career, completely unaware that he was sleeping next to the very federal banking executive who literally owned the financial leash attached to his entire fraudulent corporate empire. Judge Harrison sat back heavily in his large leather chair, a look of profound, undeniable respect instantly washing over his stern, weathered face. I walked gracefully out from behind the defense table and approached the massive black binder resting squarely in front of the judge. The document you are currently holding, Your Honor, is not a simple basic bank statement or a standard quarterly profit report, I explained, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with the highly attentive federal magistrate. It is a completely comprehensive 400-page forensic financial audit that I personally and secretly conducted over the last 6 grueling months. It meticulously details a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme, orchestrated entirely by the petitioner sitting in that witness box. I reached out, opened the heavy, dark cover of the binder, and flipped directly to Section 4 of the index. I pointed to a complex series of highlighted banking ledgers, heavily redacted for client privacy, but crystal clear in their mathematical devastation. Mr. Julian testified passionately earlier today that he was a brilliant, hardworking venture capitalist who built an empire from scratch. I continued my tone, completely devoid of any human emotion. The absolute truth is that his firm is a rapidly collapsing, highly volatile Ponzi scheme. When his legitimate market investments began to actively hemorrhage millions of dollars early last year, he decided to artificially inflate his quarterly growth reports by stealing directly from his own loyal clients. Specifically, he aggressively targeted the Peterson family trust accounts, knowing they rarely audited their quarterly statements due to a long-standing personal relationship with his firm. Over the course of 9 consecutive months, he systematically and maliciously siphoned exactly $2,400,000 from their protected institutional investment portfolios. I turned the heavy page, revealing a terrifyingly complex web of digital routing numbers and obscure offshore corporate registries. He did not simply transfer the money directly to his own personal domestic accounts. I explained, breaking down the intricate criminal architecture for the completely silent court. He routed the stolen client liquidity through a tangled labyrinth of 7 different international shell companies registered deep in the Cayman Islands. He used those unregulated shell companies to aggressively wash the stolen funds before quietly depositing the clean, untraceable money into a private domestic limited liability company registered solely under his own personal social security number. He then brazenly used those embezzled client funds to pay for his fleet of luxury vehicles, his ridiculously expensive custom-tailored suits, and the massive monthly rent for his 24-year-old mistress's high-end Gold Coast apartment. I tracked every single solitary penny of that $2,400,000 across 3 different continents, completely bypassing his incredibly amateur digital security measures. I currently possess the exact routing numbers, the specific offshore account passwords, and the digital encrypted signatures he used to authorize every single fraudulent transaction. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the wooden witness box. He was physically shaking his entire arrogant, invincible facade, completely and utterly pulverized into worthless dust. But I was not finished. I had one final, utterly devastating strike to deliver a strike that would permanently and legally fuse his massive financial crimes directly to his horrific domestic physical abuse. I reached into my tailored suit jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a small, neat stack of crisp white papers. These were not thick, confusing legal documents. They were standard bank-issued verified wire transfer receipts. I handed the small stack of papers directly to the armed court bailiff, who promptly and silently passed them up to the waiting judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deeply terrifying cadence that commanded absolute attention. "You have already witnessed the pristine, high-definition video footage of my husband violently assaulting me inside our corporate property. You clearly heard him explicitly confess to the financial embezzlement during his unprovoked violent rages. But I want to direct your specific undivided attention to the exact digital timestamps printed clearly in the top right corner of those wire transfer receipts you are currently holding." The judge quickly picked up the receipts and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked incredibly closely at the bold black numbers printed flawlessly on the pristine white paper. The first receipt shows a massive offshore transfer of precisely $400,000, I stated calmly, my eyes burning into the side of Julian's head. "Please note the exact timestamp of that specific fraudulent transaction. It was processed at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday." I paused, letting the specific devastating time hang heavily in the freezing courtroom air. That transfer was executed exactly 2 hours after he brutally struck me across the face and split my lower lip open. The judge quickly flipped to the second receipt, his eyes widening in profound, absolute horror as he fully connected the terrifying data. The second receipt shows an even larger transfer of exactly $800,000. I continued relentlessly marching forward toward total victory, timestamped at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a Saturday. Exactly 12 hours after he physically shoved me violently against the cold marble kitchen island and threatened to break my jaw. I walked right up to the witness box and stood mere inches away from Julian. He shrank back against the hard wooden chair, absolutely terrified of my physical proximity. Every single time he beat me, I explained to the completely silent, paralyzed courtroom, my eyes locked fiercely onto the broken, pathetic man sitting directly in front of me. Every single time he used his physical strength to terrorize and humiliate me, he immediately retreated to his private, darkened study, locked the heavy door, and aggressively moved the stolen client funds to frantically cover his fraudulent tracks. He actively used the dark adrenaline of his domestic violence to fuel his massive corporate fraud. The physical abuse and the financial embezzlement are not separate, isolated, random incidents. They are inextricably linked, bound permanently together by the exact same digital timestamps of 2:14 in the morning. He did not just hit me because he was angry or stressed. He hit me to brutally assert his absolute physical dominance right before he confidently committed massive federal wire fraud. He thought the heavy doors of our penthouse shielded his crimes from the world. Instead, he was simply providing me with the exact mathematical receipts I needed to completely destroy his entire life down to the very last cent. The financial annihilation is absolute, and the paper trail is completely undeniable. The suffocating silence in the courtroom was suddenly and violently shattered by Julian. He leaped up from the heavy wooden witness chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated primal rage. He gripped the wooden railing so hard, the polished timber groaned under the immense physical pressure. "You have absolutely no right to touch my company," he screamed, his voice breaking as it echoed harshly off the high federal ceilings. "You are a completely insane, vindictive woman. That venture capital firm is my absolute sole intellectual property. I built that entire financial empire from the ground up with my own bare hands. You cannot just hack into a secure banking portal and steal my corporate liquidity. I will sue you for every single penny you have ever made. I will sue the Apex banking conglomerate for gross financial negligence and malicious corporate overreach. I will have you permanently disbarred, Marcus, and I will see you both thrown into a maximum security federal prison for the rest of your miserable, pathetic lives." He was completely unraveling right in front of the Honorable Judge Harrison. The calculated, charming facade he had worn for the last decade was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, desperate flailing of a man who realized he was drowning in a vast ocean of his own toxic lies. Richard Montgomery, his expensive divorce attorney, simply stared at the floor, refusing to make any eye contact with his wildly out-of-control client. The armed court bailiff instinctively placed his hand firmly on the heavy black holster resting on his hip, preparing to physically intervene if Julian attempted to charge across the courtroom. I did not move a single inch. I sat perfectly upright at the defense table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched him scream and threaten and beg for the universe to somehow bend back to his will. I let him exhaust his lungs completely. When his screaming finally subsided into heavy, frantic panting, I looked directly into his bloodshot, terrified eyes with an expression of absolute chilling, deadpan calm. "I do not need to touch your company, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through the lingering echoes of his desperate outburst like a surgical blade. "Apex Holdings officially acquired your entire venture capital firm at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." Julian froze completely. His mouth hung open, but no sound escaped. The judge leaned forward, his dark eyes locked entirely on me, hanging on every single devastating syllable I delivered. I continued speaking, my tone radiating absolute, indisputable corporate authority. When I legally completely liquidated our joint marital accounts yesterday morning, I did not just remove your personal spending money. I intentionally completely drained the primary liquidity pools you illegally used to secretly prop up your failing corporate margin calls, because your venture capital firm was massively overleveraged and relying entirely on stolen client funds to maintain basic daily operations. The sudden total lack of capital immediately triggered a catastrophic critical default clause buried deep within your master operating credit agreement. I stood up slowly, walking deliberately toward the center of the courtroom, making sure every single person present understood the absolute genius of the trap I had built. You never bothered to carefully read the complex underwriting documents when you secured your massive corporate credit lines, Julian. If you had actually read the fine print, you would have realized that the Apex banking conglomerate held the absolute senior secured debt position over every single asset your firm possessed. When your operational accounts hit $0 yesterday morning, you immediately legally defaulted on your massive corporate loans. I paused, letting the cold, hard financial reality sink deeply into his panicking brain. And as the senior director of compliance for Apex Holdings, I simply exercised our legal corporate right to aggressively call in the entirety of that defaulted debt, because your firm possessed absolutely zero legitimate liquid assets. To cover the massive outstanding balance, Apex Holdings initiated an immediate hostile corporate takeover. We legally acquired your entire venture capital firm. Your client lists your intellectual property and your commercial real estate leases for literal pennies on the dollar. Julian stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly as he collapsed back into the hard wooden witness chair. He shook his head back and forth rapidly, his mind violently rejecting the terrifying truth. "You cannot do that?" He whispered, his voice incredibly hollow and weak. The federal banking regulators would never allow a sudden, overnight corporate acquisition without a massive, thorough investigation. They absolutely conducted an investigation. Julian Forrest replied, a cold, razor-sharp smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. Before I initiated the hostile corporate takeover, I personally handed the entire 400-page forensic financial audit directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I gave them the exact offshore routing numbers, the forged client ledgers, and the pristine high-definition audio recordings of you explicitly confessing to bribing federal compliance officers. I completely exposed your massive $2.4 million embezzlement scheme to the highest federal authorities in the nation. The courtroom was so entirely silent, you could hear the soft humming of the digital projector cooling down in the background. The judge looked at Julian with an expression of such profound, absolute disgust that it physically radiated from the elevated bench. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not block the corporate acquisition. Julian Furthard explained, methodically closing the steel doors of his permanent cage. They actively expedited it. They officially classified your entire venture capital firm as a highly toxic, fraudulent enterprise. While you were sitting in this very courtroom this morning, crying fake tears and showing the judge the bruises you intentionally inflicted upon yourself, a massive team of federal agents actively raided your corporate headquarters. I took a single step closer to the witness box. They kicked down the heavy glass doors of your beautiful, expensive office exactly 1 hour ago. They seized every single corporate computer, they locked down every single digital server, and they formally interviewed every single one of your terrified employees. Your massive venture capital empire simply does not exist anymore. It has been entirely erased from the financial map, absorbed completely into the apex corporate infrastructure, and dismantled for scrap to pay back the clients you maliciously robbed. Julian was struggling to breathe. He clutched his chest, his expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looking like an oversized clown costume on a rapidly shrinking, pathetic man. Everything he had ever valued, his wealth, his elite social status, his massive, unchecked corporate power, had been completely and utterly destroyed in a matter of seconds. "You do not own a single share of stock," I told him, delivering the final, absolute killing blow with merciless precision. "You do not possess a single dollar of corporate equity. The luxury company vehicles have already been fully repossessed by the bank. Your exclusive corporate credit cards were permanently deactivated at dawn. You are completely, entirely broke." He stared at me, tears of genuine, absolute despair finally welling up in his terrified eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for some kind of impossible mercy, but I raised my hand to silence him. "And since Apex Holdings now legally owns 100% of the firm you formerly operated," I continued, my voice echoing with total, unquestionable dominance, "I am officially your direct senior corporate superior. Based on your documented gross financial misconduct, your massive federal embezzlement, and your explicit violation of our corporate ethics policies regarding the assault of a senior banking executive, your employment contract is permanently terminated. You are not just broke, Julian. You are fired." The word hung heavily in the freezing air of the federal courtroom, an absolute final judgment delivered with flawless, devastating execution. Richard Montgomery finally slowly stood up from the petitioner's table. The high-priced aggressive attorney gathered his heavy leather briefcase and his expensive legal pads. He did not ask the judge for permission to speak. He did not look back at his completely destroyed client. Richard simply walked directly out of the heavy wooden courtroom doors, abandoning Julian entirely to the federal nightmare that was rapidly consuming him. Julian was entirely, utterly alone. He sat completely paralyzed in the wooden witness box, his entire life completely reduced to absolute ashes. He had entered this courtroom believing he was an untouchable titan of industry who could easily manipulate the federal legal system to destroy his quiet, obedient wife. He finally fully realized that he had never possessed any real power at all. I had simply allowed him to hold the steering wheel while I quietly, meticulously built the massive concrete wall he eventually crashed his entire life into at maximum speed. I turned my back on him. I did not need to watch him cry. I did not need to listen to his pathetic, desperate excuses. I walked calmly back to the defense table and stood next to Marcus. My brilliant brother-in-law offered me a single, highly respectful nod. The absolute financial slaughter was completely finished. The ownership flip had been executed flawlessly. The venture capital firm was dead, and the man who had violently terrorized me in the dark was currently suffocating in the bright, unforgiving light of total, absolute justice. Judge Harrison had witnessed many dramatic corporate downfalls in his long, prestigious career, but he had never seen an individual completely orchestrate their own absolute destruction with such blind, arrogant enthusiasm. The judge understood perfectly that my corporate maneuvers were entirely legally bulletproof. I had utilized his own massive, unchecked greed as the primary weapon against him. By forcing me to sign the marital settlement agreement and the restrictive divorce papers the previous night, he had legally and entirely severed my personal wealth from his toxic corporate liability. He had demanded absolute total ownership of his company, completely unaware that the company was a massive federal crime scene waiting to be actively raided. The charismatic, wealthy predator who had violently backhanded me just 3 weeks ago was completely gone. In his place sat a completely terrified, ruined man who finally understood the terrifying, profound magnitude of his own monumental stupidity. The financial annihilation was complete. Judge Harrison sat completely motionless on his elevated wooden bench. The overwhelming magnitude of the criminal evidence presented before him had completely and fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the entire federal courtroom. He looked down at the fabricated, glossy photographs of the self-inflicted bruises that Julian had arrogantly submitted just 1 hour ago. He looked at the massive 400-page financial audit detailing the incredibly complex embezzlement scheme. He looked at the pristine white bank receipts connecting the violent domestic battery directly to the millions of stolen offshore dollars. Then the judge looked directly at Julian. The stern conservative magistrate who had initially glared at me with profound disdain was now directing the absolute full weight of his judicial fury toward the trembling venture capitalist sitting in the witness box. Mr. Julian, the judge, began, his voice no longer just stern, but vibrating with a terrifying and lethal authority. You entered my courtroom this morning seeking emergency equitable relief. You filed a sworn legal affidavit under the direct penalty of perjury. You sat in that witness chair and you deliberately, intentionally, and maliciously lied to a federal magistrate. You used the sacred legal mechanisms of this court to attempt to extort and completely destroy the life of the very woman you had been brutally abusing and financially exploiting for years. I have presided over this federal court for 3 decades. I have seen countless violent criminals, murderers, and corporate thieves stand exactly where you are sitting right now. But I have never in my entire professional career witnessed such an arrogant, brazen, and utterly sickening display of pure, unadulterated hubris. You genuinely believed that your expensive suits, your elite social connections, and your massive bank accounts placed you entirely above the fundamental laws of human decency and federal justice. You were completely, incredibly, and catastrophically wrong. The judge picked up the heavy blue folder containing Julian's emergency ex parte petition for the domestic violence restraining order and the temporary financial conservatorship. The judge held the fraudulent legal documents high up in the air for the entire packed courtroom gallery to clearly see. He did not simply deny the emergency petition with a verbal order. He placed his hands firmly on the thick stack of papers and physically violently tore them entirely in half. The loud, ripping sound of the heavy, premium legal paper echoed sharply through the completely silent, breathless room. The emergency ex parte petition for a domestic violence restraining order is immediately and permanently denied with extreme prejudice, the judge declared, throwing the torn pieces of paper forcefully into his wooden wastebasket. The arrogant request for a temporary financial conservatorship is completely and entirely dismissed. You have absolutely no legal standing in this court of law. You have entirely surrendered any and all rights to marital, equitable relief by committing aggressive federal perjury and actively fabricating physical evidence to purposefully defraud the legal system. Your entire legal strategy was built on a massive foundation of criminal deceit, and it has just completely collapsed underneath your feet. Julian shrank back into the hard wooden chair, his entire body shaking violently. He could not look at the angry judge. He could not look at his empty petitioner's table where his expensive attorney had been sitting just moments ago. He simply stared blankly at his expensive Italian leather shoes, fully realizing that his wealthy elite existence had been permanently and violently terminated. There would be absolutely no miraculous legal loopholes to save him today. The protective walls of his luxurious, privileged life had been completely shattered, leaving him entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the massive crimes he had so carelessly committed. The judge picked up his heavy, solid wooden gavel, holding it tightly in his right hand. He did not strike the sounding block immediately. He leaned far forward, his dark eyes burning intensely into Julian's terrified, pale face. Based on the overwhelming, indisputable high-definition audio and visual evidence officially submitted to this court today, I am taking immediate unilateral judicial action, the judge stated, his voice dropping to an incredibly low, terrifying register. I am officially issuing an immediate emergency bench warrant for your direct physical arrest. You are hereby formally charged with multiple felony counts of severe, aggravated domestic battery. You are formally charged with extreme criminal extortion. You are formally charged with actively fabricating physical evidence to maliciously defraud a federal court. And you are formally charged with direct, aggravated federal perjury. The judge struck the wooden sounding block with a massive, violent crack that made Julian physically jump high in his seat. The armed court bailiff immediately stepped forward, unclipping the heavy metal handcuffs from his black leather utility belt. Julian raised his hands weakly in a pathetic, defensive, trembling gesture. "Please, Your Honor," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, dry, agonizing sob. "It was a terrible mistake. I can fix the money. I can pay the clients back everything I took." The judge completely ignored the desperate, pathetic plea. "You cannot buy your way out of a multiple-count federal perjury charge," the judge replied incredibly coldly. "Your stolen money is completely gone, and your fraudulent venture capital firm has been entirely liquidated by the bank. You are no longer a wealthy, powerful titan of industry. You are a violent domestic abuser and a massive corporate thief, and you are going directly to a federal prison cell. The absolute power you so desperately craved and violently protected has been entirely stripped away from you in the blink of an eye." At that exact, precise moment, the heavy, solid oak doors at the very back of the federal courtroom swung wide open. The sudden, sharp movement drew the immediate collective attention of every single person sitting in the packed gallery. Two tall, heavily built, imposing men, wearing identical dark suits and highly polished shoes, stepped smoothly into the silent room. They entirely bypassed the standard security checkpoints, walking with the absolute, undeniable, and terrifying authority of federal law enforcement. The bright, overhead fluorescent lighting caught the unmistakable glint of the solid gold FBI badges clipped securely to their leather belts. They did not rush their movements. They walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the courtroom, their eyes locked entirely on the broken, trembling man sitting helplessly in the wooden witness box. Marcus stood perfectly still at the defense table, his face a flawless mask of absolute cold professional satisfaction. He had flawlessly anticipated this exact, precise timeline. Late last night, while Julian was incredibly busy, taking photographs of his self-inflicted bruises and arrogantly dreaming of his inevitable legal victory, Marcus had placed a highly secure direct phone call to his top contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had quietly and methodically provided the federal agents with the encrypted digital banking ledgers, the hidden offshore routing numbers, and the pristine audio recordings of the massive corporate embezzlement. The FBI had spent the entire long night secretly verifying the staggering financial data, completely corroborating the massive $2.4 million theft. They had waited patiently outside the heavy courtroom doors, specifically timing their dramatic entrance to perfectly coincide with the absolute destruction of Julian's federal perjury scheme. They knew exactly how incredibly dangerous and financially toxic this man truly was, and they were more than eager to permanently remove him from the public corporate sector. The trap had been flawlessly executed with the exact precision of a perfectly synchronized military operation, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation escape or desperate legal maneuvering. The two federal agents bypassed the empty petitioner's table entirely and walked directly up to the elevated wooden bench. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with completely silver-gray hair, offered the judge a brief, highly respectful nod. "Your Honor," the lead agent said, his deep, authoritative voice carrying clearly across the completely paralyzed room. "We are here to formally execute a massive federal arrest warrant. The suspect sitting in the witness box is actively being charged with multiple severe counts of federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, international money laundering, and the direct, explicit bribery of federal banking compliance officers." The timeline of his complete destruction was now entirely absolute and perfectly instantaneous. Julian had walked into this federal courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, firmly believing he was an untouchable, invincible god among men. He genuinely thought he was going to legally strip me of my entire existence and permanently banish me to a life of absolute, miserable poverty. By 11 o'clock, he had been completely exposed as a violent, abusive sociopath on high-definition video. He had been permanently and publicly fired from his own venture capital firm. He had been entirely stripped of his massive fraudulent corporate wealth. He had been found aggressively guilty of severe federal perjury by a highly respected judge. And now, as the clock slowly ticked toward noon, he was actively being surrounded by heavily armed federal agents, preparing to drag him out of the courtroom in absolute total public disgrace. I sat quietly at the defense table, watching the precise, flawless execution of my meticulously planned trap unfold exactly as I had designed it. The entire physical and financial reality of his arrogant, elite existence had been completely vaporized in exactly 3 short hours. The dramatic fall was entirely immediate. The financial devastation was absolutely total, and the legal justice was incredibly, beautifully absolute. He had foolishly believed that his immense wealth and his masculine intimidation could easily conquer my quiet submission. He had tragically underestimated the silent, lethal patience of a forensic auditor who specialized in permanently burying arrogant men under the crushing, unyielding weight of their own monumental financial sins. He would spend the rest of his miserable, pathetic life locked inside a concrete cell, constantly replaying this exact morning in his mind, endlessly tortured by the undeniable fact that he had eagerly and enthusiastically handed me the exact tools I needed to completely destroy him. The immediate fall was officially complete, and Julian was never going to rise again. The 2 federal agents moved with terrifying synchronization. Their heavy footsteps echoed against the polished hardwood floor of the courtroom as they bypassed the empty petitioner's table and closed the final distance to the wooden witness box. Julian was completely trapped. His entire physical form seemed to shrink violently inward as the reality of his total destruction finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant ego. The lead agent, a tall man with piercing silver gray hair and an expression carved from absolute stone, reached out and firmly grasped Julian by his expensive tailored shoulder. The agent did not raise his voice, but his command was absolute and entirely unforgiving. "Stand up," the agent ordered, pulling Julian roughly to his feet. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and domestic battery. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you begin exercising that right immediately." Julian stumbled forward, his expensive leather shoes dragging pathetically against the floor. The charismatic venture capitalist who had confidently strutted into this federal courthouse just 3 hours ago was entirely gone. He was replaced by a trembling, sweating hollow shell of a man who suddenly fully understood that he had absolutely zero control over his own destiny. He looked wildly around the massive, cavernous courtroom, desperately searching for a single friendly face, a single microscopic loophole, or a single drop of human sympathy. But Richard Montgomery, his high-priced aggressive divorce attorney, had already completely vanished from the building, abandoning him entirely to the federal wolves. The stern, honorable Judge Harrison sat high upon his elevated wooden bench, looking down at Julian with an expression of such profound, absolute disgust that it seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. The packed courtroom gallery watched in absolute breathless silence, completely captivated by the monumental, spectacular downfall of a highly abusive corporate tyrant. Julian's frantic, terrified eyes finally locked onto me. I was standing perfectly still at the heavy mahogany defense table. I did not look away. I did not blink. I simply watched him drown in the deep, dark ocean of his own toxic, fabricated lies. He suddenly violently pulled away from the heavy grip of the lead federal agent and stumbled frantically toward the wooden partition that separated the witness stand from the defense tables. He gripped the polished wood with shaking, trembling hands, his knuckles turning completely white. The second federal agent immediately stepped forward, reaching for his heavy utility belt, but I raised my hand in a slow, deliberate gesture, asking for a single brief moment. The agents paused, maintaining a tight, highly secure perimeter around the completely broken man. "Victoria, please." Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. His face was entirely pale, his eyes wide with genuine, absolute terror. "Please, you have to tell them this is all a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we were just going through a difficult emotional phase. Tell them I did not mean any of those terrible things I said. I will give you everything. I will sign the penthouse completely over to you. I will transfer every single dollar I have left into your personal accounts. I can change Victoria. I swear to God, I can completely change. I will go to therapy. I will do whatever you want. Just please, do not let them take me away to prison. You are my wife. You promised to love me." His pathetic, desperate words hung heavily in the freezing air of the federal courtroom. He was actually trying to weaponize the very vows he had brutally violated for years. He thought he could still manipulate my emotions. He genuinely believed that the quiet, submissive woman he had violently abused in the dark would suddenly reappear to save him from the bright, unforgiving light of absolute federal justice. I looked deeply into his bloodshot, pleading eyes and felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity. There was no sadness. There was only the cold, surgical satisfaction of a flawlessly executed corporate and personal liquidation. I took a slow, deliberate step forward until I was standing directly across the wooden partition from him. I leaned in close enough to smell the stale, expensive cologne and the sour, nervous sweat soaking his custom-tailored shirt. I kept my face entirely blank, a perfect, unreadable mask of cold, calculating authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to completely destroy him. I spoke in a low, steady, terrifying whisper that cut straight through his desperate, pathetic sobbing. "You told me I was lucky you let me live in your house, Julian," I said, repeating the exact arrogant words he had thrown in my bleeding face just 3 weeks ago. "You told me I was completely useless and that you could erase my entire existence with a single phone call." I paused, letting the immense, crushing weight of his own profound stupidity completely suffocate him. I do not need your apologies, Julian. I do not need your money because I already legally acquired every single asset you ever owned. I looked directly into his terrified soul and delivered the absolute final killing blow. Enjoy living in the one I just built for you. I stood back and offered the two federal agents a single, highly respectful nod. The lead agent immediately grabbed Julian's arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly shut around his wrists echoed like a final, devastating gunshot through the silent federal courtroom. Julian let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure, total despair. His legs finally completely gave out beneath him, and the two large agents had to physically drag his dead weight down the center aisle of the gallery. He cried and screamed my name, begging for a mercy he had never once shown me, but I had already completely tuned him out. The financial and emotional slaughter was absolutely finished. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the agents dragged him out into the bright hallway. The sound of his desperate, pathetic sobbing slowly faded away completely, swallowed by the massive architecture of the federal legal system. The gallery remained entirely frozen in absolute shock, processing the breathtaking, flawless execution they had just witnessed. Judge Harrison gently placed his solid wooden gavel down onto his desk, offering me one final, deeply respectful nod before silently dismissing the court. My absolute victory was entirely secured. I turned away from the heavy mahogany defense table and began walking calmly down the long center aisle of the federal courtroom. Marcus walked perfectly in stride right beside me, his dark tailored suit cutting a sharp, authoritative figure against the pale walls. We did not speak. There was absolutely no need for words between us. The massive, highly complex legal war we had meticulously planned in the dark shadows of my home office had been won with breathtaking, absolute perfection. We pushed through the heavy wooden gallery doors and stepped out into the sprawling marble corridor of the courthouse. The junior clerks and legal assistants parted silently, giving us a wide, respectful berth as we made our way toward the grand exit. We walked out through the massive glass revolving doors and stepped directly onto the busy downtown pavement. The sharp, bitter Chicago wind immediately hit my face, whipping my hair back, but I felt absolutely no cold whatsoever. The adrenaline and the profound, pure sense of total, absolute freedom burned like a quiet, steady fire inside my chest, keeping me perfectly warm. The gray clouds above the towering city skyline seemed to part slightly, allowing a single bright ray of afternoon sunlight to reflect off the glass facades of the surrounding high-rise buildings. Deep inside the pocket of my tailored charcoal skirt, my encrypted mobile phone suddenly buzzed with a sharp single vibration. I stopped walking for a brief moment and pulled the device out. It was an automated, high-priority notification from my elite real estate broker. The message was incredibly brief and flawlessly executed. The $3.5 million luxury downtown penthouse had just been successfully listed for sale on the private international market. The final remaining physical anchor to my past life had been officially completely severed. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling a deep, resounding wave of absolute icy peace wash over my entire body. A loud, piercing siren wailed in the distance. I looked up and watched a heavily armored black police cruiser pull aggressively away from the side-loading dock of the federal courthouse. It merged quickly into the heavy city traffic, carrying the completely broken, ruined man who had once foolishly believed he was an invincible god. I did not watch the vehicle disappear down the street. I simply turned my head and looked forward toward the bustling financial district, where my massive corporate empire was actively waiting for my absolute command. I had survived his brutal physical violence. I had survived his psychological terror. I had exposed his massive corporate fraud. The complex calculations were entirely complete. The heavy digital ledger was finally completely balanced. The massive debt was permanently paid in full. I took a deep, clean breath of the sharp city air and began walking forward into my brand new, incredibly powerful life.